what is the limiting principle? If where does how I define myself, where is the boundary of that? Where does it bump up against something? And I don't know what the limiting principle is. I'm not saying that transgender shouldn't exist or shouldn't be accepted because of it, but I do think that philosophically what we have to go is, where does my description of myself stop and bump into your experience of me? Here we are. We got a lot today.
Fire away, dude.
Do you have a lot?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. So you've heard of The Social Dilemma on Netflix?
No.
There's been a couple of people talking about it. I got an email from Mind Valley. It's a documentary about how social media is bad.
Oh, yeah, I saw this. It seems very self-explanatory. That's why I didn't watch it.
I was like, what year was this released? Yeah. Why is this popular? Did you know?
I saw it on trending, and I was like, what am I going to hear? And it literally has a cell phone icon.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to tell me that Facebook on my phone is bad for me?
Did you know that social media is purposefully addictive?
Yeah. Apparently there's something called dopamine, and when you get a notification, your brain releases it. I was like, what?
We've
known this for a decade.
So that was my first thought. I watched 30 minutes of an hour and a half. I was like, this seems like it's a time capsule.
Yeah, good for you. I didn't even click it.
Completely out of time. Well, I wanted to chat about it because it seemed popular, and I didn't want to watch the other one with little kids twerking. So I was like, I'm going to skip that one. But the fascinating thing about this that I think is the perhaps deeper level analysis is that it's this documentary about how bad social media is, and it's tearing the world apart, and how it's got all of these casino-like things featured with the infinite scroll that they have, the likes being dopamine, figuring out tagging your photos. And it's on Netflix, a platform that when you hover over a show, auto plays it from the beginning. And it seems, and they're listing all of these dangerous social media sites, and there's 10 of them, and Netflix doesn't make the list. As if somehow being not advertiser generated dollar business model exempts you from this criticism.
Yeah.
So it seemed very unself-aware that it was a sensationalist documentary saying that we have this new problem that has never existed, which is completely false. That the basic thesis is that never before have we had so many people trying to manipulate other people. It's like, how do you think communication evolved? Do you think communication is meant to convey only true facts?
They used to put cocaine in Coca-Cola. Do you think that wasn't addictive?
Yeah, it's forever. As long as there's been communication, there's been manipulation. The Madison Avenue, like Mad Men in the 60s, and even before that, yellow journalism in the 1800s.
Sure.
It just treats this as a sensationalist new problem, and I'll grant them that its scale and scope has expanded.
Yeah, I think the motivations of people haven't changed. What technology can do is make something more expansive. So
yes.
The desire to manipulate by corporations has always been there. But perhaps the fact that you carry around a supercomputer in your pocket just gives them more access to your brain than they used to have.
Absolutely. But it treats it as a completely qualitatively new issue that is, in my opinion, the oldest thing that people have tried to do is influence what other people around them do. And Netflix gets included in that. They made this documentary. It's not, at no point will there be a call to action to delete your Netflix subscription.
Well, certainly not in the Netflix video.
Yes. And it's like, why would then Facebook tell you to get off of Facebook at any time? Or why would the guy who creates or who the butcher at the store create a food that satiated you for the rest of your life? Like this is not what any business has ever done. This isn't a new problem, and consumerism underlies everything. And weirdly enough, the medium is the message, and this exists on Netflix. And then I comment on it on YouTube, and it seemed very unself-aware.
Well, the thing I thought was interesting is, who is this message for? Because I don't think it's for anybody who is addicted to their phone. It's not for a 15-year-old that is doing TikTok more than some therapist would say is healthy. They're not going to watch the documentary. And if they are, they're not going to be persuaded. It reminds me of that video I sent you. Paul Rudd did a certified young person COVID mask PSA. And as I was watching it, I was like, the only people that will like this are people who already feel this way, that everyone who doesn't wear a mask is selfish and that they're dumb. Because it's completely unpersuasive if you think the opposite of what Paul Rudd is saying. And so I was like, who's this for? This is just almost masturbatory in the sense that you get to watch it and feel good about being superior to the other people. And when I saw that
For
documentary,
those people who haven't seen it, it's Paul Rudd, and it's intended to be humorous, but he's pretending to be a young person talking in overly affected young person slang, and then at the end of it just kind of breaks down. He's like, "Wear a bleeping mask, like Jesus Christ!" Like,
which I imagine is completely unpersuasive to young people who don't think COVID is a serious thing. If you're young and you already think COVID is serious, sure, you'll like it. But my point is, well, why make a video that changes no behavior? It's kind of how I felt about this Netflix documentary, which is like, no one is going to watch this and change their behavior. What it's going to be is a bunch of people that already think social media is bad are going to watch it and then congratulate themselves, even though they still use social media.
After they spend an hour and a half.
Because they already have this belief. Yeah, so I was just like, okay, well, this seems great marketing in the sense that you create a video people want to watch because it's self-affirming. And that's what everybody wants to watch, is something that agrees with what they do. But in terms of changing behavior, it seems like a very ineffective thing to do, is release a documentary on Netflix with information we've had for the last 10 years.
So what I think, I was like, okay, so how does this work? If you presume that every system is working, right? Towards its actual goal.
Oh, it is.
Exactly.
I think
so
it's
the
effective.
and I was thinking about it as it's the same idea. We've talked about how car advertisements with beautiful women actually sell Macy's products for lipstick because the beautiful woman is wearing lipstick, which lets you know this is a beautiful woman. And so you better be especially receptive to makeup advertising. Netflix had the Cuties documentary, and it also had this, which were huge on YouTube. And so in a weird way, this is Netflix promoting YouTube to now talk about Netflix, which will reverse promote watching Netflix, which is exactly why I'd never heard of this until I saw it on YouTube. So the consumerist machine, it absorbs everything. And this is part of it. I'm not pretending that we're outside of it. Now we're creating content, which if we do a good job, keeps our viewer coming back to YouTube to donate more of their attention to advertisers. It's just, there's nothing you can do except move to the mountains, it seems like.
Do you want to talk about Cuties? Because it was on my list. We brought it up. So people who don't know what Cuties is, it's a documentary that, from the director's perspective, is meant to highlight the hypersexualization of young, like very young, like 10-year-old girls. From TikTok and things like that, and how they try to emulate inappropriate adult influencers. The way that they tried to highlight that is by exploiting 10-year-old women and making them do girls.
So I know this is something somebody called us out for. We made a video years ago where I was talking about, like, here's how you get girls to like us, and the comments were, they're women. They have to. And so since then, you and I both, every time we talk about a female, say women.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I don't even notice.
Because we're like, we got dinged on that so hard.
These 10-year-old girls, the video, it's basically, some people are saying, like, masturbatory pedophile material, because it's 10-year-old girls twerking and getting sprayed with water and are they documenting
it, or did they?
No, it's a fictional movie.
It's fictional.
It's fictional, yeah.
Ooh, and so that's troubling.
And so it's on camera. It's these girls are dressed very scantily, and it's like, I think an allegory might have been more appropriate here. Or something.
Why not just document the actual problem?
So this is the thing: is to highlight the inappropriate nature of a 10-year-old twerking on TikTok. They hired a bunch of 10-year-olds and then surrounded them with cameras and demanded that they twerk while they filmed it, which is just a strange way to get that message across. But actually, I'm not here to poo-poo that. What I thought was interesting is when you went to Rotten Tomatoes, at least when I last checked, it had, I think, an 85% critic rating and a 3% general population rating, which is to say, either there's a massive disconnect between what critics like and what the population likes, or there's a political message that the critics are trying to get across. And it reminded me of Dave Chappelle.
Yeah, I was going to say, just completely
Dave Chappelle
reversed.
Had a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes.
It was
and
like
then eventually,
sub 10.
And then eventually it got up to 35% from the critics and a 99% from the populace. And both of these kind of reminded me of the Hollywood or the Netflix or Rotten Tomatoes type people trying to tell you what you like and what you don't like and what's appropriate and what's not. And the population just being like, no, we think Dave Chappelle's hilarious and we don't want to watch 10-year-olds twerk. I just think it's interesting as you see, I guess, morals or messages try to come from on high and just get completely rejected in some cases.
Well, my actual question that I have not dug deeply into is how effective, and if not how effective, in what cases is that media blitz of this is good or this is bad effective at changing the reaction of a population? So it seems like with Cuties, it's not been very effective. In fact, it had almost backlash to now the point someone like me who hasn't seen it has been hit with the first message of it's really, really bad. So even if I were to look at it, I'd be coming in expecting that.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's closer, if the critics can move something though. That seems to be my, like if something has a 98 critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and an 80 from the audience, I wonder how much critics didn't boost that. And I've seen this in myself. I sit down to watch a movie and I'm expecting something amazing. Like what was the one that everybody liked on Netflix? It was the gangster movie on Netflix.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The Irishman. Personally, I was waiting for that to get good the whole time. Yeah. I was just expecting and waiting, and I watched the whole thing, and then I walked out of it and tried to make sense of how it was good. And later on, I was like, I hated it. Yeah. Is what I concluded. But had I been more ambivalent about it, I think I would have
just turned it off.
Well, I would have just turned it off if I hadn't read the critics. But if I'd been closer to really loving it, I would have pushed myself in that direction so as to align with the critics. So I think when there's less of a gulf, the critics can nudge people towards them. But when it's just stratospheric, it almost goes reverse.
Yeah. Well, they're going to try, right? The Oscars just came out. They said you can't win Best Picture unless you have certain diversity requirements met. So they're definitely going to try to influence culture in that way.
Well, these are not the critics. This is the Academy.
That's what I'm saying, though.
Yeah.
In my mind, it's kind of like Hollywood is trying. You know, I mean, the critics are basically part of Hollywood. When they tell you that Cuties is an amazing movie and an incredibly thoughtful, award-winning film. Yeah. And then everyone who watches it hates it. To me, that seems to be coming from on high, from Hollywood. Of like, no, you want this message.
Yeah. No, I want to read that article again. I was actually going to talk about it next time because I wanted to make sure that I had the exact requirements. So let's talk about it next time, because my first reaction was, I was like, you're putting literal quotas on.
I think that's the way the world is going to go.
Yeah.
In my mind, as much as everybody right now is poo-pooing California and California politics, historically, it seems, I'm from the East Coast. I have no dog in this fight. It's not like I'm a Californian. That music and style and all this stuff tends to come from California first and then make its way to the East Coast and then the middle. And it tends to be that way too with, I guess, more progressive social things. So like gay marriage, first place I think it was being pushed for was probably San Francisco.
Certainly the hippies arose and, you know.
And so you get this kind of, first it happens in California, then it hops to the East Coast, then it moves to the middle, which makes me think, if it is the case that Oscar winning movies have to have quotas where you're like literally 13% African American, I think it's 6% Asian. How much of the population is Asian?
Well, they might have different quotas that do not match.
Sure, no, I'm saying if this is the case, I don't.
Let's read the article in more depth to understand.
Sure, I'm just saying if that's the case, I think it'll spread from Hollywood to other companies in California, and then I think it'll spread to the rest of the U.S. I mean, it's kind of the same way that trans was like totally unaccepted, and now it's very accepted. And actually, the thing that's unaccepted in most cases is saying something negative publicly about anything about trans. And so I think, like it or not, if Hollywood does put Oscar winning movies, they say there's going to be quotas. I think that's the first domino towards eventually like a much more unspoken, no duh, of course our company has to have a certain amount of people measured by the government or whatever it might be.
For a certain amount of each race or each sexual orientation.
Yeah. I think if that's what the Oscar thing is saying, then I think that's kind of the canary letting you know, like that's where things are going to go.
So goes the nation. Yeah. As goes California. Now the question is, I think the way that California has that influence is obviously through media. But I don't think they change the minds of the same generation. Like the movie producer in California is not changing the mind of the coal miner in West Virginia.
No, it's his kids.
It's his kids.
Yeah.
And so I think still these kids have it, but I wonder if there's going to be a firewall that is built, because it seems like now and perhaps I just wasn't alive in the 60s were probably a huge gulf, but there have been historical pushbacks like there were against the hippies where drugs went too far and then we locked all of these potentially very useful compounds in a cage for like 50, 60 years.
Yeah. I'm just thinking more, I saw a study, I forget the numbers, but basically it was like no one under 18 is against gay marriage, no matter where they live, no matter how red state they are. It's just we don't care, get married. That is definitely not the opinion that was held from 50-year-olds 10 years ago.
Yeah, their parents probably don't have the same opinion.
I don't know if that's how they feel. I don't know if that's how 60-year-olds feel today, but go back 10 or 20 years to a 40-year-old. It's not universally considered acceptable for gay people to get married, but every 15-year-old apparently, or not every, but a huge percentage, just cool with it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the same way that trans is going in terms of if you're young, you just think it's totally fine. Everyone that I've seen, not everyone, I keep saying that, but largely most people who are upset about it are older. And if hiring changes such that you have like explicit affirmative action rules, a 2-year-old is just going to think that's the way of the world. And they're going to think it was weird that it wasn't always that way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I was when I was watching The Social Dilemma, the distinct impression that I got is that it happens every single generation. It almost doesn't matter what you're born into. The ability of a person to adapt to their culture is nearly infinite. Like if you live in a warrior culture and they just murder people, it's like you'll just grow up and that'll be normal, and that'll be normal for your whole life. If you grow up in a society that doesn't have cell phones, though, and then you get to work at Google, you're gonna be like, wait, are we doing too much?
Yeah.
But if you grow up in a society where there's a panopticon and everything you do is being measured, none of those kids will complain about it. So it's what was interesting again about this social dilemma thing. It's all these people from another generation being like, we've gone too far.
That's what I'm saying.
We need to get back.
That's exactly my
and
point.
These kids are not gonna care.
No 12-year-old watches that and is convinced of it. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, of course they've been tracking me my whole life. How else would I get the good ads?
Yeah.
And
did you see the meme that's going around about Elon Musk and Bill Gates?
No.
So everyone's like, I'm not going to take a vaccine from Bill Gates.
Yeah.
He's going to secretly put a microchip in my body. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's like, so Neuralink is a microchip we're going to put in your body. And everyone's like, yeah, Neuralink, microchip me.
Yeah. It's funny. The PR on those guys, Bill Gates could really use a better PR team, or I guess it doesn't matter to him and maybe he's not upset, but I did the video on him. And if one presumes that he isn't, in fact, trying to commit mass genocide and is using billions of dollars to do what he thinks is best for the world and is saving millions of lives through the eradication of various diseases, then he has gotten the biggest gulf between the perception of him and his actual contribution. And Elon, I think, has a better brand in terms of just, there's people that don't like Elon and he's made missteps.
He's definitely got a better brand than Bill Gates.
Yeah. But he doesn't have, I don't think people include him in the psychotic trying to kill everyone group, which is weird because he's got almost the more, I'm going to put a microchip in your head and I'm very overt about it idea. And Bill Gates is like, no, I'm just trying to make sure that you don't get polio and or, these other things that have killed tons of people in prior generations.
Sure.
So poor guy.
You want to talk a little bit about new media, old media? Do you see the Joe Rogan thing? I think you saw it.
I don't know.
So Joe Rogan had Tim Kennedy on as a guest, and Tim Kennedy asks him, would you host a presidential debate? Joe says, I would. It's got to be several hours, no aids, no earpieces, no teleprompters, just a conversation between me and them. And I saw that clip, and I thought nothing of it. And then Trump tweeted and was like, I'm in.
Yeah.
And one, it's amazing that Joe Rogan, a guy that was a stand-up comedian turned comic podcaster, has the pull to have Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang, and now maybe Trump on the podcast.
I wonder if Trump will go on the podcast.
I think he will. And then two,
let's can we pause here? You predicted because Joe Biden's not showing up.
That's the thing. Biden wants nothing to do with it.
Of course not.
Biden wants the debates to be remote.
Yeah.
With an earpiece and someone off camera.
He'd like to record it a few days prior.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand. So you think that Donald Trump will go in alone to Austin, Texas, Joe Rogan's studio?
If he doesn't, I think it's just because of time constraints. I think it'd be an absolute win for him. I think he would look great, and I think that's a demo. You think he'd look great? You think Joe would and him would? Yeah, Joe tends to not be super aggressive to anyone. Has anyone come on there and looked particularly bad?
No, but what Joe does, he's not an antagonistic person, but he will ask clarifying questions. He will say where he disagrees, and he will say where things don't make sense to him. Mm-hmm. And so if I were advising Donald Trump, I would say go.
I would say go. Yeah. Here's the thing. Do you think that going will cost him any votes? Do you think anyone that's currently today on September 17th
could see him on the Joe Rogan?
Sees him on Joe Rogan?
No.
Okay, no. I agree. So there's no downside. Now, do you think that there's open-minded people?
I think there's a lot of
moderate.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of moderate swing votes.
Don't like Biden.
Yeah,
and would watch Trump for 3 uninterrupted hours and go, you know what? I've only ever seen him in clips. Mm-hmm. I've only ever seen CNN purposely make him look bad, and I was shocked at how thoughtful or funny or whatever it was. To me, it seems like an only upside move.
Yeah, and he would get probably, I mean, easily over 10 million on YouTube alone.
That'll be the biggest video ever.
Times 20, times another 10, so he's doing at least 20 million. He's got more reach there than almost anywhere, so I would do it.
He get more views than the debates.
Yeah.
He gets an uninterrupted platform, no moderators. Moderators tended to not like him last year when he
and
ran.
also they have the ability to, there's a team behind them going, actually that stat is untrue, and then they'll correct it on the next question, and so he's got to fight pushback.
Maybe Jamie would do that. No, and by the way, I think the biggest thing is
let's pull that up, Jamie.
None of his base is gonna be turned off by it, even if he does say something accidentally wrong.
Sure. Yeah. All right.
And he, by the way, gets to make Joe Biden look like a coward.
So he should do it. Do you think he will?
I mean, the only reason not is because he's running the country. He just literally might not be able to fly to Austin and get 4 hours with Joe Rogan. But I think he wants to. I mean, he said he wants to.
He says a lot of things that I don't think he means.
Think about how much he could rail Joe Biden for being a coward for not showing up if he did go. He said, here, we had it. We had a chance. Joe is scared. It's a great thing if Joe doesn't show up.
I guess he didn't go in 2016. He went to Jimmy Fallon in 2016. So, and Joe Rogan was still a force of nature in 2016. So I wonder if he still has handlers, and I think he could still call them off because that's his personality. But there still is a resistance to 4 ununderstood hours somewhere.
I don't know. It seems better than the Axios interview where the interviewer's trying to get you. You know what I mean? Joe's not going to show up with graphs like the Axios guy did, purposely trying to nail him on COVID.
Yeah.
Joe thinks COVID's not a big deal. That's the thing. You're sitting next to a guy who likes small government, doesn't think COVID's a big deal.
So you're telling me, here's the thing. You're telling me that he should go, and I 100% agree. But I don't know that
I don't know. I mean, I don't know the guy.
Yeah.
But if I'm on his team, if I'm his aide for the campaign, I'm going, dude, forget this thing you were going to do to be president. We got to get you to Austin, Texas.
Yeah. No, I think I would too, unless I heard a really compelling argument not to.
Yeah.
Interesting. Did you have any more on the debate thing about the Joe Biden not being there? Or?
No.
Got it. You just, because I cut you off, we talked about Trump instead of Biden.
Oh, no, I just think it's a great move because then you get to just call him a coward.
Yeah.
Which, if he didn't show up, wouldn't be inaccurate.
Cool. So what else do we got here? Oh, so we are talking. Do you want to talk about media? We're speaking to someone shortly about media. Do you want to talk about the Bridgewater story that I had sent to you?
Sure. I mean, yeah, this is a good tie-in. So in 30 minutes, we're going to talk to a journalist who works at a media company, and we're going to talk to him about basically whether media is honest or has an agenda. And
which is an oversimplification, of course. But so this one story is... this
isn't his story, by the way.
Not his story.
It's a separate story for the Wall Street Journal, I think, right?
Ray Dalio is someone that I check in with because I think he's good at long-term financial predictions as his life has borne out. So I was checking up on him, and he had a recent thing where he said, hey, we had a problem with this journalist. And he wrote a brief article where someone at his company who was a woman had a dispute about compensation. And Bridgewater had someone else say that they were not looked at for a promotion due to the fact that they were a woman. So this woman said...
underpaid. I think it was the co-CEO.
They were underpaid.
But she was underpaid because she was a woman.
And this woman, this other woman, had somehow gotten in contact with a reporter, didn't want her name involved in anything, but did say, I'm underpaid. And she said, underpaid compared to who? Well, underpaid compared to him, and him. Underpaid compared to those men? And she said, yes, I am underpaid compared to those men, but it's not a gender thing. It's not because they're men and because I'm a woman. I just think that I deserve more for XYZ reasons.
Quick question. Did she say she was underpaid or that she was having compensation discussions?
Having compensation discussions. And I think she said that she was paid less than some men. But again, she wasn't emphasizing that they were men. This reporter wrote the article that, and you can get the title of the article exactly, but is another female accusation of being paid less than men follows during time of these other accusations. And strongly implied in the title, and see if you can pull this up, Justin, if you can find this Bridgewater article.
I'll pull it up so he doesn't mess up the recording.
Strongly implied, if you read follows, is that there's this before-after causality is implied. Like the fact that she is a woman is the thing that is driving the pay discrepancy. But technically, there's nothing in the title that says it's causal, that it's because, or even that she claimed it's because. So then Dalio, because this came out, this woman was mortified and didn't want it to be the case. She contacted this reporter. I'll give you the title.
Second top female executive at Bridgewater says firm paid her less than men.
Yes. And then there's another thing. And during allegations of other misconduct or something was the secondary headline. And so she then contacts her supporter and says, hey, I didn't say that. And he says, well, actually, we didn't say that you said that. And she says, okay, I'd appreciate if you'd update the story with a quote from me saying specifically that I do not think it has anything to do with gender. And he says, well, that's our discretion. We're not going to include it.
Yeah.
Which is like,
she says, I'd really like if you would use my full statement and not just a part of my statement.
Yeah.
He says, no.
No, yeah, that's our discretion.
Up to our discretion.
And it's fascinating because what a way to lie without actually saying the words of a lie. To say it did follow, and she is a woman, and this is the issue with.
Well, my biggest thing was how obviously uninterested in the truth are you when the person the story is about is saying, "Hey, your story's inaccurate, and I have a correction you could put in," and you go, "No, we prefer it the way it is."
It's not incorrect. This is the thing. There's nothing incorrect. This is the problem with objectivity, which is to say, well, take a look. Prove to me in a court of law where anything I said is wrong. There is a woman.
Yeah.
She said this
no, I'm not
following this.
It's not libel.
Yeah.
But I'm saying the person the story is about is saying, hey, this doesn't accurately express how I feel. This doesn't accurately categorize my complaints. Can you change it to make it more accurate to how I feel since it's about me? Mm-hmm. And they go, no, I don't think we will.
It's not about you. It's about, you know what I mean?
I don't think we will. I think it gets more clicks this way.
Yes. And serves a particular agenda that is to probably to move that reporter's career forward. You know what I mean? It's probably not even so expansive as to include the women's rights movement or anything like that.
And I don't think they really care about penalizing Bridgewater because I don't think anyone is going to pull their money because Ray Dalio has the direct connections of everyone who's invested, and he just contacted them and said, so this is bogus. Here's why. Here's her actual statement. So it didn't hurt Bridgewater, but it might have helped this person's career.
Yeah. So the idea of objectivity then goes, you have to have a more robust idea of what telling the truth means, other than saying words that literally aren't false in a court of law, because you have to make an attempt, it seems, to understand the implication. And I tend to have an open mind about things, go, well, let's hear. You do not write that headline without understanding the obvious implication of it. Let's not play dumb.
Right? And if you do, let's say you do, right? Once it's brought to your attention,
correct it.
Then you change it. You go, oh my God, I didn't realize that I'd written this in a horribly...
Wow, I didn't even...
in a really aggressive way. That's my mistake. I'll make the change. But you definitely don't go, I'm not going to include your full statement.
So it really takes, okay, what is objectivity in journalism? And I don't think objectivity can exist in any field, to be clear, because you're always the fact that you're writing about Bridgewater implies that Bridgewater is important. Mm-hmm. The fact that you include the fact that it's a woman implies that that is important, and not the fact that she's 5'4", or that she has green eyes, or that she is of whatever descent, or that her middle name is Eugenia. Like, all of those things are objective truths. The ones that you select to include have the implicit idea that this is the salient trait in the story, and everyone picks that up.
Yeah.
If can you imagine the headlines like second woman with middle name Eugenia denied compensation increase? Be like, what do they have against people with that name?
And I don't know what her position was, but certainly you could see a story that says trader who made less money upset that trader who made more money got paid more.
Yeah.
And you go, well, this is uninteresting. Mm-hmm. But if one of them is a woman and the other is a male, you could say trader who's a woman is underpaid compared to a trader who's a male. Mm-hmm. And the company's like, well, yeah, but it's not because of their genitalia. We just look at their profit and loss and then we give them a portion of it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's the case here, but certainly even with that, where it clearly isn't discrimination, if you say their genders and not who made more money for the company, you can make it seem like discrimination.
You can write a million different implied stories telling the truth every time. Mm-hmm. And this is the difficulty of, I think, any kind of journalism and communication, and something that we've encountered in our relationships. So with various open relationships that we had, where it was don't ask, don't tell style, which we understand that we're each seeing other people, but we'd prefer not to know. And so it trains in you this litigious style of communication.
Yeah, it's terrible. I wouldn't recommend it.
It's awful. Where what did you do last night? I went to the bar with my friends, which is true. It's like I drove there with my friends, and then there I met someone, and then that person knows not to ask any follow-up questions. It's this whole strange way of communicating
Letter of the law thing.
That is not about the truth. That is the type of manipulation that Social Dilemma is so concerned with, but exists in every sort of human interaction where you don't want someone to know the full expression of everything that might be salient to them. So I'm eager to talk to this person to see what they make of that, if they see the same sort of thing in their organization as well, because I want to know. I want to talk to the guy who wrote that and be like, what is going on in your mind? Like, do you not feel bad about this? What am I missing that allows you to leave someone feeling so mischaracterized?
So I think I've talked to people who are similar, not this exact person. And the thing that I've heard from them is they basically say, listen, whether or not this particular woman is discriminated against doesn't actually matter, because at a high level, some women are discriminated against. And so what we're doing is getting the message out that that's a problem.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're absolutely making Ray Dalio look bad in a mischaracterized, inaccurate way doesn't matter, because what we're doing is bringing attention to an issue that's real somewhere.
Yeah.
And my comeback is always, well, why don't you just cover where it's real actually? And then you get to just, it's harder to find.
Yeah,
Ray Dalio's a bigger name. Seriously,
yeah.
If we write this, but we write KKR, no one cares. But if we write Bridgewater, people care. And so even if it is, and I'm not saying it is happening at KKR, but like if it is happening there, that's just a less interesting story. So we're going to cover it at Bridgewater to get attention to the thing. And I think that is.
This is a Juicy Smollett, like
Selfish.
Juicy. I can't even remember
Exactly.
how to pronounce his name because it's
Smollett.
Dave Chappelle.
Smollett.
Jussie Smollett.
No, and I think it's completely wrong.
Yeah.
I want to clarify, even though I'm steel manning, I think it's completely wrong. But that is how one justifies
I'll
it.
steel man it. The things they carried is a Vietnam. It's a series of stories about Vietnam. Now he outright says somewhere into the book, he says none of this happened, but it all happened. And it's a really interesting take on, like, look, I could tell you, but the specific stories of what happened in Vietnam occurred in such a way that I don't want to talk about them for whatever reason, or I don't want to tell them. But the fact that, there was a tripwire and it blew this guy's head off.
Okay, let me say though, did he use other people's real name that weren't there, or did he use fake names?
He used fake names.
So that's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. Because if I wrote a piece on the Wall Street Journal and I said, these are not real people, but they represent real people, that to me can be much more honest than me going,
you're right.
I'm gonna highlight Ray Dalio.
I take it back completely. If he wrote a piece of fiction that was called The Things They Didn't Carry, and it was about a woman in a firm somewhere, and she was discriminated
Go a
against.
different way. What if that
totally
Vietnam
fine.
story had a terrible general, had a guy that was corrupt, killed his men with callousness, was racist, and the person's actual name was John Smith, right? But he called the person, let's say George Bush Sr.
Yeah.
That would be completely wrong, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's what this is. This is using a real person.
Yeah.
And so you're not just explaining a problem in the abstract using fake names, but real stories that move you in the same way that Vietnam book does. Because the point of the Vietnam book is the story moves you because you knew it was a real person and these atrocities happened to someone and it's visceral, right? Mm-hmm. But this is just going, that company right there does discrimination. Mm-hmm. And they're going, no, we don't. You go, well, someone does, and now we brought more attention to the issue. It's like, well, yeah, but don't do it by throwing my name in the mud.
And he also declares in the book, he says none of this happened. It's a literary device. I'm thinking of the other one, the guy on Oprah. What was it? A Million Little Pieces? James Fry was a guy who wrote this story of his, I think it was addiction. I never read the book, but it was an Oprah's book club bestseller, and he was on the thing talking about his addiction, and then it came out that it was hyper exaggerated. Mm-hmm. And she had him back on the show, and she was just like, why didn't you just write a book of fiction? Like, why did you have to say it was real? And in his defense, the answer, which I don't know if he said to her, he was just ashamed, is you wouldn't have read it. Like, you wouldn't have read my fiction book. You needed to believe it. Same thing. There was a book that I was into that has been highly called into question. Never mind. I can list these books off.
No, but here's what I'm saying. Game of Thrones is completely fictional and it got read a lot. If you have to say your story is true in order to get people to read it, but it's fake, then you don't deserve to get read.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I understand that that's your selfish motive, but
totally.
That's the same thing as any marketer lying. So it's like, you wouldn't have read it. Okay, so either write a true story that's moving or write a story that's obviously fiction and sells like Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Or by the way, like Brandon Sanderson or Rob Hobb, all these people who aren't Game of Thrones but are successful in their small way.
Stephen
But this
King
person
Neil
decided
Gaiman.
that they would be greedy and focus on their own wealth and fame by tricking people. And I'm like, I think that that's not a good excuse. You wouldn't have read it if it were fiction.
Oh no,
It
it's
just
not a
means
good excuse.
Write a better book.
It's just the reason.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah.
that's why he did it.
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. This person would probably argue the same thing about why use Ray Dalio's name is because he gets the most, because we're talking about it, and we wouldn't talk about it if it were a firm that no one had ever heard of. You know what I mean?
I wonder if it's more than that. I don't know that there's even that much. There's this weird, and I don't think a lot of people, and I don't know this particular individual, but in my conversations, I don't see a lot of people spending a lot of time thinking deeply about what honesty means. And so this person can go, look, show me the lie. Where's the lie? She is a woman. It did follow this, show me the lie in my article. What you make of it is none of my business. Could be the perception. And my job is simply to not tell lies. Donald Trump got the statistic wrong, which is a lie. And that's not good. And I do think that in journalism and in marketing, I am not like, because we encounter this all the time when we talk to people that want to do some sort of contracted work for us. People have not deeply thought about what being honest means.
And in life, dude, I want to get a COVID test because I'm going to see my family soon.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna pay, I think it's like $150 to get a same day result because I'm gonna do it a day or two before the flight. And you can get that for free if you lie and say you have symptoms. And someone's like, why don't you just go to this thing and say you're having symptoms? Like, it's not, that means I'm stealing from this hospital and this health insurance provider that's paying for this test. Like, it's not like they just magically occur. You're just saying, why don't I, instead of paying my own money for a service that I want, rob a hospital or rob my insurance because it's cheaper for me? This is basically the same thing as just going up to the owner of the hospital at knife point and being like, hey, can I get $150? But it's just like I think most people, if they hadn't heard this whole spiel and they were going to pay for a COVID test and you say, hey, you can get it for free if you just say you're having symptoms, a huge part of the population just goes, oh, sick. Well, I don't think honesty is necessarily a high priority. And also what's funny is no one thinks they're dishonest. Like even the person that gave me that advice, I was like, well, that's a lie. And they're like, white lie though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like who cares? That person still thinks that they're honest. Everyone thinks they're honest, really, it seems like, with a few exceptions.
Yeah, it's definitely the exception when you talk to someone like, oh yeah, I'm definitely lying. Yeah. That they have that sort of self-awareness.
It's just people's rules. Do you think that lying means you always try to convey the truth? Do you think it means you never utter a lie, but you do what this article did and completely misrepresent facts? Do you think it's, I lie, but only some of the time when like it's really convenient? 95% of what I say is the truth though. So if 1 out of every 20 sentences is a lie and 19 are true, that makes me honest.
Yeah. Can I get credit for, isn't 95%?
Yeah, and it's like, no, 1 out of every 20 sentences is an incredible, borderline pathological liar.
Yeah.
They go, well, 95%, dude, that's an A. I'm honest.
And what you are instead is, if you look at, for that person, if you're sitting through this, you're going, well, I only do it rarely. What you'll find is that you actually have one true God, and that is the God of what is good for me. And you serve that God 100% of the time.
Yeah.
And 95% of the time, it doesn't get in the way. And so your honesty actually isn't at any cost. It's really just, no, this gets me what I want. Like to tell this person that I'll be there at 10 p.m., like that gets me what I want. But if you lived in a scenario where you couldn't get what you want by being honest, you'd watch your honesty shrink and shrink and shrink. Now, that said, we talked about this, I would 100% lie to the Gestapo if they showed up at my door in 1940 and asked if there were Jews in the attic.
Yeah. Like, we flash back to Nazi Germany, they knock on the door.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, Jews?
No.
I'm not Jewish.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
So I think that you need a degree of physical safety in order to be able to even consider some of these things. So, you and I are fortunate enough, when I look around, it's like, look, I got very little excuse, if any, to lie. Like the inconveniences that would occur to me are of an amount that I can afford in so many different ways, emotionally, financially, et cetera. But I also think that's true of a lot of the people that we're talking about. And
then the question is, it's just what do they justify? Because what if this guy's going, well, I got a family. If I get famous from this book that I wrote, I can provide for them better.
Yeah.
So really it's food on the table. So I'm just going to trick all these people into buying my book. everyone's got a reason that their lie was not a bad thing.
Sure. So yeah, I don't want to spend too much on this one person because I'd much prefer to have this individual tell me what they are thinking and justify, because I actually don't know that we've even guessed what they might say. But before that, we got this call in 10 minutes. So let's hop into one other topic.
Sure.
Do you want to, just before we do, I think this one's a shorter one, our Connor Murphy conversation.
Oh, sure.
Do you want to reflect on that?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to go first? Do you want to talk about how the conversation went or how I feel like I handled myself? What do you want to talk about?
We can talk about it. So I'll start because I was the one who wanted to speak to him. So I watched I have friends actually that knew Connor, and this whole thing was going down. I was trying to figure out like what is happening.
Yeah. Well, do you want to start? So the reason we want to talk about it is because it was the least well-received podcast we've ever done. That's why we want to bring it up, because I think it's interesting. More downvotes than any other podcast. Largely the comments, which I mean, I appreciate, are normally very positive. We're saying this was the least thoughtful, most narcissistic, blah, blah, blah. I won't go into what they're saying, but a very large negative reaction to what Connor was saying about himself and spirituality. And so that's why we're like, oh, we should revisit this, because in our audience, at least, this was more controversial than most of the stuff we talk about.
Sure. So I was the one who wanted to have him on. You didn't the whole time. You're like, you were not into it. And my thought was, I was open to the idea that Connor had an Eckhart Tolle experience. So Eckhart Tolle, if you don't know him, wrote The Power of Now and the New Earth many years ago. And as far as I can tell, since then, has remained in this slow-moving state of being.
Yeah, but unlike the Dalai Lama, who got there through 5 hours of meditation, basically was suicidal until one day had borderline a mental break, and then came out of it a very Zen-esque guru.
And hasn't gone back as far as one can tell.
Yeah.
It just sort of like absorbs questions for 15 seconds at a time. And it could be a performance, but has kept it going for so long that I was like, wow, can a spontaneous transformation like that occur? And if so, Connor is claiming to have had this experience. I wonder if that's the case. Now, there were plenty of things that sort of tipped me in the direction of like, it doesn't seem to, but the fact that he fasted for 40 days as a prior bodybuilder, to me, showed a complete reorientation of priorities.
At the time.
And then we spoke to him even 30 days after that. He hadn't had sex, and he was someone who had been, with the validation conversation that we had with him, I think never really got to this, but in my opinion, he was hyper driven by validational sex. Like somebody who goes out, anyone who goes out and has sex several times a week with several different people. The reason that I believe that is validational in its nature is because the orgasm itself is probably better at least half the time by yourself with your own hand in the privacy of your own bedroom. So you're not doing it for just the physical pleasure or the need to release.
No, or if you were, what you would do is quickly just hone in on whoever gave you the best orgasm, and that's who you'd see the most.
Exactly. The fact that it's a variety of different people and the excitement that one feels, if you were to dig into that, as I have in my own experience and my friends have as well.
I was going to say, no knock to Connor, by the way. This is most guys at some point in their lives go through this phase where new for the sake of new is fabulous.
Yes.
And some people would argue biologically, evolutionarily, you're triggered to always have that to some degree. So I'm not trying to pick on Connor.
No. But that if one expressly cares about pleasure, things like massages and finding one person who is an expert at tantra, like that sort of stuff would be the direction that one went for the need of that pleasure. And the variety tends to say something about the type of man one is, that one is so attractive, and that is the thrill in some ways. So we didn't really get to that, and I thought that he would see that in himself. He disagreed. He didn't see that in himself. But then we had the conversation, and my struggle during the conversation was I thought that he would have what felt like to me more profound insight into his condition, and I thought that he would have stepped away, or at least have had some interesting answer to why continue to promote Bang energy drinks, why continue to lift weights and aim to be 195 or 210 weight, like why hit a number on a scale.
No, there could have been, I mean, we'll talk about this after our call because we don't have time, but there could have been a Tim Ferris style story involving an early memory that got repressed, that led to so much that he's now realized has occurred. There could have been a seismic shift in his views on the world based on uncovering some sort of traumatic memory. Just wasn't the case.
Yes. And so I thought that there would be more of that. And on the conversation, I was surprised. Now, during the conversation, my mode, and maybe I need to adjust this because there's a bit of interviewing that is going on, is I'm trying to see it from his perspective as best as I can. And I'm trying to like step in his worldview, and maybe I don't get it. And I don't claim to be enlightened. So for me to step inside his head, I have zero ability to do that. I kind of have to take him at what he's saying. But upon reflection, certainly, and it was almost immediately after we finished, I was like, a lot of that didn't add up. Having overcome all trauma without any sort of revisiting experience seems very rare to me. We can talk about Tim Ferris.
No, and I think because I don't want to just bash on Connor. I appreciate him coming in for reflecting on ourselves as conversationalists. I think we both came away from that thinking, okay, Ben doesn't so much have a problem with disagreeing, but potentially needs to figure out how to phrase his questions in a way that gives the person a chance to come out the other side with a good answer. Because I think I was, to your point, I was critical before he came on. I was critical while he was on. And while I appreciate the questions or the comments that were saying, hey, I'm glad Ben asked critical questions, as I was reflecting, I thought I could have asked him in more words. And I could have asked him in such a way that I gave him a chance to process and give a thoughtful answer. Instead of sometimes he was just like, well, you can't just give up all money and move to a farm. And I was like, well, why not? Well, that doesn't really give a guest a chance to have a thoughtful response because they're just put on the spot. So that's where I think I could improve myself, and I plan to work on that. I think from your perspective, combination being less confrontational than I am, or less comfortable with confrontation, combination feeling me next to you, being, I think, overtly critical, you maybe in hindsight would change how you carried yourself as well.
Well, I don't know. I have been thinking about this. I don't know my proper position as a conversational, if I invite someone to come on, because we've talked about having people on who we disagree with far more than this, who like we sit, I'm pretty sure, on opposite views of things that I feel strongly about. And it feels strange for me to invite them on and then be confrontational, call them out for lying. And I'm not talking about Connor in this case. To say that, you are not who you claim to be I don't know how to go about that. I haven't quite figured it out.
I think the goal is to do it in a friendly manner. I mean, I'd like to get to the point where people who are watching this know that if there's something I disagree with, I'm going to ask a question about it. I honestly have no interest in being someone who brings people on and then that person can promote whatever they want, say whatever they want. And I'm just like, yeah, all right, cool. And in my head, I'm going, I disagree with this, but I'm not going to say anything to please the guest. I'd rather just not have guests and talk you and I.
Sure.
But I do think there's a way, like I said, to be literally just disagree as much or more than I did with Connor, but in a way that's friendly and doesn't feel like it's attack. Just it's an exploration, which is what I really want. Is like, man, maybe you're an enlightened guru. Maybe I have the wrong impression. I'll try to bring that humility here. And at the same time, I'm going to ask you why it seems hard to believe. And I want to give you the opportunity to prove me wrong or to kind of, prove that I'm not wrong, in which case I'll continue to, in a nice way, dig into stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know. That seems to be the way that I would want to conduct a conversation,
sure,
especially if it's going to be public.
Sure. So my conclusion with regard to how I thought and felt and what I think at the end of the day is my sense of Connor, and I'm completely open to his experience of himself is certainly more firsthand than mine. But I do think that there are times where people can see things about you that might not be obvious. And this is true of everybody. I think that he had a peak experience. And I think he had an incredibly long-lasting psychedelic after thing that got him through 40 days of fasting, 70 days of just like abstaining from sex or anything, which was, I think, very, very huge for him. But I do think that he has come back down into the ego and the personality, not quite the same as when he went into this experience, but that is not nearly as close to that peak as he was. I also think that he likely had some, there were moments we didn't talk deeply about it. His strategy for getting people to go to enlightenment was faking his own death. And not only is that, to me, cruel, and I was trying to understand his perspective of, it's all just a game, so it doesn't matter. To me, we're still a lot of these people don't recognize it's a game. And so it's cruel to those who think it's like a little kid is playing this game super intensely and you're like, haha, screwed you.
Well, I do think so. And first of all, by the way, we're not endorsing ayahuasca, a water fast, celibacy. Like a lot of stuff is dangerous if unsupervised. But for me, one of the things I experienced on ayahuasca was this idea of what I was calling faction, where instead of thought and action, It was just one thing. I'd have a thought and I'd be doing it. So I'd literally be like, I have to pee. And before I had thought, I was up and walking. And I was almost observing myself doing that. And I think then in hindsight, if you did something crazy or something really counterculture, you'd have to justify it.
Yeah.
And so there is a chance that it wasn't that premeditated to do the fake suicide, to give away your car.
Even if it was, like, how many people were enlightened as a result of that? I think there are probably more effective ways to go about enlightening a large group of people.
I'm just saying, depending on how much ayahuasca is still in your system affecting your brain, that's not even how thoughts work. It's not like you plan, take an action, and then the reason it happened is because of what you think. A lot of times things are just occurring and your brain is trying to like process why they're happening. And so I could imagine if I were deep in the throes of ayahuasca, giving away my car, then being asked 2 days later, like why I gave away my car, and having to come up with the reason. But like, who knows how accurate that was to in the moment when thought and action really does, for me at least, get very muddled. Yeah. And it's much less clear than premeditated thought action. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
So to wrap, I think ultimately it's a time will tell thing with anybody who goes through any sort of peak experience, whether that's landmark forum, it's psychedelic thing, or just realizes something in themselves and they need to go to the gym and exercise more. It's like, okay, we'll see how big this breakthrough is in 1 year's time. And I think the measure of enlightenment to a degree is of course subjective, but also the love and compassion that you show to the people around you. So that will be sort of, if when I look back in a year from now, was he onto something? Wasn't he? To what degree? That would be what I look to, is like, how does he treat those people around him? And that's true of myself and of
I was
anybody.
gonna say that's not unique to Connor.
No.
I went to Landmark Forum. I got super hyped up. I was having a peak experience. I was like, I'm never gonna feel jealousy again.
I'm gonna be kind to everyone always.
A week later, I was in an open relationship at the time. A week later, I was jealous. Like that's you could have caught me the day of, and I would have said some crazy stuff on camera about how changed and fixed, and it wouldn't have been enlightened, but it would have been the Landmark Forum terms for him. And then a month later, it was almost like I didn't go. So I do think there's just a natural tendency for everyone to get really hyped when they're in the moment with ayahuasca or Tony Robbins or whatever it might be. So it's certainly no fault to that, because I think everybody's guilty of that.
I know. Well, that's the thing. I can't even be critical, because I've walked out of these things before and been like, you're looking at the new Charlie. And then a week later, it's the same old shit. All right. So Tim Ferris.
Yeah. Did you get the chance to listen to it?
I listened to almost all of it. Yeah. Okay. Up until the very end.
So for people who don't know, Tim Ferris, very famous influencer, wrote 4 Hour Workweek, has one of the biggest podcasts. He has hinted at in the past a trauma, but came out for the first time ever and talked about it. He was regularly sexually abused from the age of 2 to 4 by his babysitter's son. And he didn't go into detail, but he said, just picture the worst things you can imagine. That's what was happening to me. He completely blacked out every memory he had between 0 and 5 for most of his life, such that at age 6,
didn't know that this
and
had
at age
happened.
30, had no idea anything that had occurred before his 5th or 6th birthday, basically. But had a lot of neuroses, very quick to anger, had some cutting experiences in high school, loves combat sports, addicted to caffeine, didn't know where any of it came from, just thought that he had bad brain chemistry is what I think he blamed prior. Then he went on a Vipassana.
I should also say he was suicidal at various points of his life.
Oh yeah, and didn't know why. And has previously blamed his brain chemistry. Just said bad roll of the dice, because he didn't know that this had occurred. Did ayahuasca and remembered the trauma, relived it, but didn't get triggered by it. And at the end of the experience, says he basically put the trauma back in the box, didn't address it.
Knew that it happened. Yeah.
So now for the first time in his life, I think at like 35, is like, oh, this did happen, but has no thoughts about it, continues with the existing neuroses, just carries on with his life, and then goes on a Vipassana retreat while fasted and on mushrooms, and basically has a psychotic break. So much so that he thinks without the guidance he'd had from the shamans there, he would never have returned. And that was the point where he had the trauma in his mind again. And then he goes on to talk about everything he's done since to try to basically put himself back together, and how this one root cause is the symptom of basically, I think he says like 11 major neuroses or problems in his life, and just talks about the journey that he went on. So I think that's the context. Do you want to start? You want me to start?
Go ahead.
So he has a couple interesting things. That the first thing I wrote down, which I think is something I hadn't known or thought about. If you do just men and women together, boys and girls together, 14% of children are sexually abused. he says, and his guest, who was also raped by her stepdad, I think from age 9 to 12, the co-host for this, basically the stepfather said, I will murder your mom and your brother if you tell anyone.
Yeah.
And so they both said,
It's way higher. Yeah.
No, they both said you deal with shame and you feel completely alone.
Well, I was just going to say it's way higher than 14% because Tim's not in that count. Several people I know aren't in that count.
Sure.
Like to say that it's half seems generous. I think it's
Well, even let's say it's 14, it's 1 in 8.
Yeah.
I think what they were saying is when they were kids, when Tim was 6 or 4, when she was 11, it was happening. She thought she was the only person in the world it was happening to. She mentions that she was reading like a Dear Abby, and someone wrote in about being molested. And it was the first time in her entire life she'd ever encountered anyone in the world that this had happened to. And she cut it out and put it under her bed because she wasn't alone. And so I thought that was the first thing worth highlighting is it's incredibly widespread problem. And to them, at least, I'm not an expert on this at all, and neither are they, but they're just sharing their experience. Part of the damage to the psyche is the shame and not being able to share this and thinking that you're damaged because it happened to you or broken. And they said, both of them said that one of the best things that they ever did for themselves mentally was start to share it with the people in their lives and see people didn't run away or view them as broken or anything like that. I thought that was really interesting just to think about how widespread of a problem this thing is, that when you're growing up, you really do think either doesn't exist or happens on the fringes. You know what I mean?
Well, Tim closed with it. She said, what is one thing that you hope people get out of this? And he said that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, we can take these off now.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating because there's a line that the number one line in marketing that you can say, and you'll see it in every sales letter, is you're not alone. And then they'll sell you a product off the back of it. But what they've tapped into is this just need that people have to not feel alone in their suffering and their experience. And the idea that compassion is like suffering with someone is one of the most generous things that you can do with somebody is to have compassion for them. I was struck by that as well. Like the aloneness being such a huge part of the difficulty of all of these things.
You know, and I think the thing is when you are an adult and you've gone through this or you haven't gone through this and you hear, okay, let's say 15%, 25% of the population has had this happen, you understand the numbers, right? You go, okay, cool, my front brain can process that. But it doesn't necessarily make you feel less alone. Now, what makes you feel less alone is when you go to your friend or your family or your spouse or whatever and you say, hey, this happened to me. And even if it's never happened to them, they go, I love you.
Yeah.
I know this happened to you and I'm not running from you and I'm not disgusted by you. And that experience of like sharing it is infinitely more helpful than recognizing you're not alone because you heard the stats.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
100%. Yeah. I thought that, mad credit to him because clearly I've watched interviews years ago where he's like, this is something I can't really talk about here. So clearly it's something that he's been aware of and struggling with and trying. And so finally posted it. The fact that's a huge step forward for him.
Yeah.
I also saw, and what I've experienced, because I talked about this a little bit on the podcast, is he would spend about 20 minutes on the events and then about 2 hours on the tools and the intellectualizations. And I don't blame him at all, but I was most moved and struck by his personal recounting. And to me, the tools are important, but that's the Cliff Notes as far as I'm concerned. Like the point that he made, you're not alone. He was most powerful in those first 20 minutes. Yeah. And I think that's where he helped the most people. And of course it's like, okay, now what? That's super freaking useful. But, and I don't blame him at all for this, but even just as I was listening, I was like, what helps other people is literally you telling your story.
Yeah.
And then also here's the link to some therapies at the bottom, but like,
well, can I say that that's kind of what you just did though, right? You're like, I've had stuff happen to me.
Well, I talked about
it on the podcast previously, probably 2 months ago.
No, it was like 8 months ago.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, so do you want to talk about your experience? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Have I not? I will. I just don't want to repeat myself.
You said it once 8 months ago, right?
So I thought we talked about it at length. So yeah, I need to protect some of the parties involved. I was molested when I was 8 to, I don't know exactly the ages. It was over the period. I don't want to say much more than that. Nobody needs to go on on a rampage trying to figure out
Doxing
spree. And dude, it was fucking uncanny listening to him talk about his experience.
Yeah. So what's your experience been?
Just ridiculously similar. So the order of him, I'm trying to think of the things that really I was like, oh my gosh. One, putting it in a box, being like, this didn't happen. Or I was actually where he was my whole life after his experience, because I was old enough to know that it didn't happen. I was like, this just didn't matter. Other people are affected by these things. And like, I didn't think about it but once every 6 years. And I had no feeling about it. And it was, whatever. Other people, I'm just fortunate to have this constitution that this didn't bother me. And then I had an ayahuasca experience that was the most difficult night of my life. It was the worst thing ever. And it was a embodied psycho experience of what that felt like that I didn't feel at the time. It was the worst experience of my life. And I think I talked about this in some, but it started with, and the layers were incredible because I take, am I repeating myself if I said this all in the cast?
I think let it rip.
Okay. I told the story. So we take the ayahuasca and I go in this weekend. I'm like, I really am just here for the person that I came with. Like, I'm supporting. I take it 15 minutes in, I go down.
Yeah.
I have my thing in my hand. It's this plastic thing. I come to and I crack it in between my hands. And I don't realize that my puke bucket is just in pieces.
Yeah.
And they're like, help him. And next thing I know, I'm on my knee trying to be carried out of the thing. I've never been like this debilitated 15 minutes after taking it. So I'm separate from the circle the whole night. And there's one guy that's with me. And as it's going down, it's horrible. Indescribably horrible. I'm lost in this sea of red and confusion and terror and illness. And at one point, I hear this voice like, tell Shane you're gay. Tell him you're gay. I was like, but I'm not. But you said, you have to tell him. You have to tell him. I was like, but why would I say it? I'm not. I don't. Am I? And it was like, it was so horrible for about 30 seconds. And I did, because I didn't want it to be true. It's like, is this the case? And I said, Shane, I'm gay. He goes, oh, that's cool, man. I was like, wait, that's not. And then it immediately didn't feel right coming out. I was like, that's not true. It's not. And then I just broke down and I told him, I said, Shane, I was molested. And that was the beginning of these layers of things that I hadn't experienced. Because of course, one of the things I went, oh, I must have wanted this. Therefore I am gay, and this is why this happened. But that evening was going through all the layers, being like, this is my body. Whose body is this? Like total confusion of like, wait, and it was horrible. It was so uncomfortable the whole time.
Yeah. Is that similar to Tim? Did you go through disassociation?
Total disassociation. I was looking at my body. I was like, whose is this? This is me. Like it didn't, I was coming back to my body for the first time. And so in any event, that evening went on and I was clearly shaken up, and it took me time beyond normal to like get myself back together. And then I've continued to do those sorts of things. And kind of from that experience, I shared with people. I think I probably after that was willing to have, similar to what Tim said, like this happened on the podcast. And told various people in my life and have hit a level of understanding where at this point I actually want to have a conversation with this person, because my understanding of their story, as brief as it is that they were also victimized in their childhood. And to me, I just see like this cascading chain of hurt and suffering. And I fortunately never went on to do anything like that. But if I look at the relationships in my life, what I've now been doing MDMA a lot, it's got its tendrils and everything. And so I related to that with Tim. Tim was just like, there's a million things that it's affected me too. And I didn't recognize that. So do you want me to, how?
Sure. I don't even know what it's affected.
Okay. From the top. So, this was just very recent in MDMA. So I'm still, this is news to me. You know how I hate going home? I fucking hate my house.
Yeah.
That's why. So I didn't know this. I have, and I spent years like, okay, I went to college and then I was like, I'm going abroad and then I'm going further abroad and then I'm going to California. And I'm never like not going home for Thanksgiving. And the reason, which I truly believed up until months ago, was like, I hate plane rides and I hate, this, and the food isn't the best. And like, it's just not. And that house is almost like if you've ever seen Stranger Things, that there's a world and an upside down that both exist in my mind. So I can see my healthy, happy house, but there's also an upside down house that exists in my psyche. And it's horrible, and it's filled with shadows and all of these things. That's where it's occurred, and I feel especially that way about my bedroom.
And I'll just cut in. Wasn't your family?
No
one that lived there. I just want to make sure people
yeah.
recognize not your dad, not your brother, not your sister, not your
yeah.
mom. This was just someone who happened to have come to your house.
Yes.
So I'll just say that because I know you'll want that said. Yeah.
So that there's this upside down dark world feeling about my house that has kept me away from there. It impacted and probably every one of my important relationships. So I mean, I can start at the top. My dad, I remember telling him, and he didn't do anything wrong, but he sunk because I told him when I was younger. He just sunk in his chair. Oh my God, and the way that I interpreted that was I fucked up. Like I can't do this. I completely fucked up. He's ashamed of me. And I know that that's not the case. And he didn't even say about that. But some part of me
he was upset with himself probably for allowing it to happen. He wasn't upset with you.
And which is crazy because there's nothing like what could he have done in that moment? But of course I didn't even know that I felt this way at some level. And all of this is deep down. I'm completely unaware of all of this. So I think that's contributed. I've talked about to strife with my dad and arguing with him. And it is easier for me to be combative with him than it is for me to be sensitive with him, because the sensitive feelings are closer to those feelings of I fucked up, I'm so sorry, like total shame. Relationships in terms of intimacy, I realized that there is a and I can do it now, there is a guardedness. I have never fully broken down in front of anyone, and that I think goes back to that first experience in telling my dad and beyond that, in that I was the older brother, am the older brother, and viewed my job as protecting the family. And and again, he didn't do anything wrong, but like last time I was on MDMA, I had this memory of being 6 years old, going to my dad's baseball game. He used to play baseball. My sister came with me, and we had this box, and there was this 8-year-old, and 8 to 6 is a big difference. He was being mean, and he was saying, this is, we built a fort. He's like, this is mine now. And he tried to claim it. And I had taken karate, and he was hurting my sister, and I punched him in the nose. And it gave him a bloody nose, and he ran away crying. And my dad told that story so many times. And I was like, this is it.
Yeah, this is how you get love.
This is my job. Like I am the protector. And the feeling of the upside down house was like, I didn't protect this house. I didn't protect myself. My dad is hurt and disappointed that this happened. That feeling of just having failed and needing to redeem myself, to make up for it in some way. And then also being the people that are most difficult are my family. So like, how do I need to make up for it, but I can't make up for it in the actual root cause. I'll just go start a big YouTube channel. You know what I mean? Like I'll just go make some other, I'll make some girl fall in love with me. I will redeem myself anywhere but the place where I feel that I've failed. There was another one that I was going down, but in any event, it's had it tendrils in everything. And I'm constantly surprised that I've done MDMA a handful of times, and I had this ayahuasca experience that I come back. It's like, holy shit, you're fucking kidding me. More. But I still get more, you know, and this last time was like, oh wow, that's why you hate going home.
Yeah.
But the good news is that, and I remember the last one, is that and I think this will be my next big one, is I can't break down in front of other people, which is that feeling of my dad, like seeing me like that. And I can cry, you know what I mean? I cry semi-frequently at this point, but there's a difference between crying and breaking down. And breaking down would be a complete collapse, like inability to stop myself. Because even when I'm crying, I go, I could turn this off if I need to. You know what I mean? Like I'm allowing these tears. These are tears that I've chosen to allow at this moment.
They have my blessing.
Yes.
Well, dude, I'm not Oprah. I'm absolutely not gonna guide you there. I think as your friend, my job is not to do that either. You know, Oprah would like look into your eyes and touch you, and you'd start to cry. I'm gonna leave it totally up to you to do it at your speed. So
one, I think that's a big learning for me is that patience, like the speed at which my head moves is 100 times faster than the speed at which my heart, my body moves. It does feel when I am in these scenarios, it feels like my emotional body is not perpetually, but disabled. You know what I mean? It's like needs extra help, like needs a teacher to sit there and be incredibly, incredibly patient, such that all of the tools and the tactics and the tricks and the shortcuts that have worked for business and all of these other things, like leave that shit behind. What this part of you needs is like you to sit still, maybe on some mushrooms or some stuff, take a couple deep breaths, and accept that after 8 hours, you might have gone this far, and that can be wonderful.
Yeah.
That there's not a race to the end of this. The race is exactly the problem. The race is what made me race to all of these other conclusions about how I had to have the answers to everything. No, it's cool that, I'm great. He was upset, just didn't bother me. It's like, no, I'm going to have to go very, very fucking slow into all of this.
Well, you did. So you said sit, but then you said sit with psilocybin. I thought it was interesting because Tim basically, and the woman he's talking to has done 30 years of talk therapy. And they both agreed you get there faster with psychedelics.
Sure.
I was interested because Tim recommends almost the exact same thing as you do, which is he started with ayahuasca. Now he thinks that's
too much,
which is kind of exactly where you're at, right? Like you're like, the first thing you'd ever done, you never smoked a cigarette, never smoked weed, you did ayahuasca. And you would not recommend that to other people. Same thing with Tim. The things he recommends now are MDMA, psilocybin, parts therapy, and cognitive behavior therapy, which is actually, I think, exactly what you found most helpful as well, right?
Yes. It was uncanny, the things that he was saying. I was like, oh yeah, ayahuasca completely, well, actually ayahuasca didn't, it was the Vipassana after, but I don't regret having done ayahuasca. I don't want to scare anyone from it, but if you know that you have this in your history, I think MDMA/psilocybin is the place to start. MDMA is a warm blanket as you go through it, and ayahuasca is just like
a jetpack.
You're just thrown into it with no ability to escape. So I will be, for the foreseeable future, not doing ayahuasca. It will mark a large point of growth when I return, and I know I will one day. I will know when I'm like, no, I've handled this aspect, and I'm ready for ways of growth that are not related to like healing this wound or this trauma, that this is way too big a gun for at this point. But yeah, MDMA, psilocybin for me for the
Do you have anything else? So in my impression was those are the big four for Tim. So, and I know you don't want to recommend tools, but I do think there are probably people listening who...
No, I think tools are important.
Well, I think there's probably people listening who have had things happen. They know they happened. They can't get access to an MDMA therapist.
Dude, it's such a shame how expensive this stuff is, I have to say.
And how illegal it is.
I mean, even the good therapists are $250 an hour.
Yeah. So that's the thing. So let's say that I was a victim of sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to this podcast and I go, okay, it sounds terrifying, but I'm ready to integrate.
Yeah.
What should I do?
Save up your money, or maybe you're someone who has money, and find an MDMA person with experience. Ask around. Unfortunately, I can't tell you. I want to tell you, trust me. Like I want to be the person who does this, but they're marching forward. Or even if you're like, I'm not comfortable with that, even micro doses of psilocybin, which can be 0.1 to 0.2 or 3 grams, depending on the individual. And then sit alone in your room with the intention to just explore this. That's a low enough dose that it shouldn't like take you too horribly deep, but you'll probably have new insights, new thoughts that'll start to like ease it. What I think of as the psychedelic experiences are just so valuable. They're like sprints. You cover so much freaking ground when you do 8 hours of a macro dose, and then weekly I go talk to family integration parts therapist, all this kind of stuff. And that's just keeping up the practice for me.
Got it.
But into recognizing that this shit is expensive. If I look back at the amount of money I've spent, it's thousands and thousands of dollars. And I know that not everybody has that. So what I will say is that the right therapist is going to be important, because therapy is like chiropractic, is like everything in the world, in that there's such a wide array of skill sets. So you want someone that has experience with what you would call trauma. The last thing that I'll say is that what reminded me of Tim is that I hate the word victim and hate this, and that's always my experience. Every time I'm in a psychedelic zone and it's like this comes up, I'm like, not this shit again. We're done with this shit. Like, we're not going to revisit this fucking molehill and make a mountain out of it. I will not allow it. Like, move along. Next up. And I think that that's very common in people, is that I just don't want it to be the deal that it apparently is. And I'm continually frustrated when it comes up, and I go, fucking God, like, you're supposed to get through this faster. He echoed a similar sentiment of like, I can't believe that this was 30 years ago. It doesn't matter. Like, you've moved along. And I think a lot of people will find reasons. He had some, I have some, why their situation doesn't qualify as traumatic. And I still am not totally convinced that mine is traumatic. I'm dead serious. Half the time I think I'm making this, not that it happened, I'm making the severity of it up.
Got it.
I'm like, this is just a game you're playing with yourself. This isn't even that important.
But if something happened to you when you were like 16, that's not traumatic, right? I'm asking for a friend.
Asking you for a friend. I think as I've gone through, and I have stuff in my life at various points that has been upsetting, certainly, and this doesn't make it not, and I wouldn't want to rule it out, because what I do is, because I'm all right on the cusp, and she says, before the age of 10 is when it really affects. I was like, well, I was practically there. So
I was 9. So what's the difference?
I was a fast learner.
I'm basically 13.
Yeah. But also that is the excuse that I use to minimize it, is my age. I constantly go back to the age, and I go back to the severity. I go, well, Tim had even worse things happen to him. So the severity and my age are what I go to. And I think that that's just something to be aware of, that people always go the severity and the age. And what is worst is it's the shame and the inability. If it's something that you haven't talked about or told for many years, that's sign enough that it's a massive fucking thing in your psyche. Yeah.
It does seem like the psyche does form when you're young. To the extent that, like, it's crazy the stuff that I've come to through my own psychedelic use, which, by the way, I just want to clarify, we're not doctors, and also you shouldn't do anything illegal. So if you're going to do psilocybin, you should go to Synthesis Retreat in Amsterdam. I've never been, but it's legal there. Yeah. But yeah, so don't do anything illegal. We're not doctors. But when I've done my own experiences, it's shocking that the stuff that comes up is like so innocuous. It just happened to happen when I was 6 or 4 or whatever it is. And I was like, this fight I had, or like this thing I got caught doing, or this totally inconsequential experience, this is shaping me. But it's just amazing. If the same thing happened at 25, it wouldn't move the needle in terms of who you are as a person. But when it happens at age 4, it just does.
Yep. I think age is a huge one. Kids lack the ability, clearly, and also some of the conclusions that you draw emotionally at that age. Like, my dad looked down, and that meant the fucking world to me, and I didn't even know it.
We have a friend that had an experience that I don't even think he's like interpreted correctly between him and his mom, but his takeaway is that he'll never ask for help in anything ever. And like, I see it carry through in his life, basically, with rare exception. And it's just a thing that happened when he was a kid. Wasn't a sexual abuse. It was just a thing that happened. And to his detriment, to this day, just like cannot ask for assistance with anything.
So, and this is why I don't know that one has to. And you hear some people say the story doesn't matter. And I agree. It's to a degree, you don't want to have to go back. But the people that I have seen who have made the biggest strides have brought the past to conscious awareness. I know few people like Eckhart Tolle who just seem to skip that stage and just go, who needs to revisit the past? I'm enlightened. It seems to be a very common thing, is like, if you haven't gone back to your childhood, and I mean several freaking times, because it comes out in layers. I've done this one particular incident, several incidents, but over and over and over again. There's more to be done. And the good news is it's not like a chore. It's like there is something on the other side that is hopefully better. And Tim talks about being connected with his body, and I see that as the sort of the prize.
No, it can sound really daunting, because Tim's basically saying, I didn't know any of this happened. Then I went on this Vipassana retreat with mushrooms, And then since then, it's been the obsession of my life for 5 years. But he also says, I've never been happier. I've never felt more free emotionally. I've never felt lighter. So I think it's easy to hear the process and go, this is daunting. I'm just going to keep this locked away.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think everybody who's gone through the struggle seems to say it was worth it to process it.
Yeah.
So.
And just the last thing that I'll close on to your point is there's a handful of things that our society recognizes as being traumatic. And sexual abuse is one of them, and we're increasingly doing so. And it has made, the reaction of people around me, which is this, has somewhat made it easier to do. But to your point, there are things in all of our past that aren't going to get classified by everyone around us as traumatic, and they very well. They are, they affected your psyche in a very, very important way. And you drew conclusions about the entire world because of it. And if you were to share it with somebody, they might go, well, that's not a big deal. But
shake it off.
The subjective experience of that is so much more important because it's your rules that you're living by. It's your subconscious rules that are driving your whole life. So I do think that there's going to be a shift in society where we recognize the absolute fragility, but also the resilience of the psyches of children. It's like they're fragile, but then they form these incredible coping mechanisms to go through life and operate really well.
Yeah, the problem is the coping mechanism is great at the time, but then you don't shake it.
Yeah. And to be clear, if I'd never done ayahuasca, I would still have one of the top lives in the history, like such a fortunate thing. And this is something that I think people will struggle with. I struggled with it, which is like, it's so good for me. My life is so incredible and so good. It can't have a bad thing in it. I can't feel sorry for myself. There are people without water. We don't have time for this. So these are traps that I've continually fallen into, which just slows me down from actually like feeling this shit, addressing it in my own life, feeling better, and then being able to even help more people. All right, let's rip through some questions.
All right, first one is, sometimes I like to tell my friends about Charisma on Command, and it usually takes a bit before they're on board with what it's all about. I think this usually comes from the fact that people don't initially feel comfortable when hearing that someone is trying to be charismatic in a sort of calculated manner. I'm curious to know if that impression ever affects your business or how you tell your friends about what you do for a living.
Totally, it affects our business. Yeah, so, and this is true of any kind of personal development in most regards, whether you're talking about health and fitness or you're talking about growing a business. Rather than discuss it with them, I think the best thing you can do is send them the raw material. Send them a video that you think that they'll like. So for instance, when I was talking about, you got to do the 4-hour work week, man, it's incredible. Nobody was interested in hearing my description of it. But if I could get people to read the first chapter of the book, they'd carry themselves through it. So number one, if you want your friends on board, send them a video. Don't describe it. But yeah, it's definitely something that slows our business down. There's a stigma against working on one's personality because you are expected to just have a magical personality. Kind of like guys are expected to just be good at sex.
Yeah.
It's one of those things.
Probably like our view count versus shares on Facebook is probably so disproportionate because it's not, when you're losing weight, you're so lauded. Yeah. You're going, hey guys, I'm losing weight. I've lost 20 pounds, 25 more to go. Here's a video I saw. Everyone's like, yes, you're amazing. And if you're like, I was shy and I'm getting better at it and my relationships are getting better, and here's a video where Charlie talks about Peaky Blinders. Yeah. Like no one wants to share that because no one's going to be in your comments like, yeah.
I'm insecure too.
Yeah. They're all just going to be like, boo, be yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, weirdly enough, even compared to other areas of self-improvement, there's a stigma around it's okay to lose weight. It's okay to go to the gym, but it's not okay to work on your ability to be confident in social situations.
Yep. Yes. And there's weird subsets of that are okay, like learning presentation for a business meeting.
Public speaking, totally fine.
Okay. Yep. Right? And I think it has to do with those things which our society attributes to identity and says that they are innate about you. So the way that you behave in a social setting, that's who you are, quote unquote. That's not what it really is just a series of habits that you picked up in middle school. No, that's who you are. And so people freak out when you start trying to change who you are, which is ultimately silly. But how do we deal with it? Volume. We just try to get a lot of eyeballs on, and there's enough people that are willing to take that slightly uncomfortable leap. But we don't get a lot of like referrals to Charisma University, for instance. Except when somebody's made that change and people are like, what the heck? Happened? Yep. That's the one case where the proof is in the pudding. Yep. But yeah.
We're kind of tight on time, so we're going to answer these questions fast. It's not because we don't like them. It's because our memory card is capping out. I'm going to buy a bigger one.
Next one is, I've just learned that occasionally I'll watch a motivational video and feel pumped for a week or even a month, but then either forget all about it or move on to something else after a month. It almost feels like it's a manipulated market that sells its consumers the hope of a better future.
Almost like, yeah.
If you were in a similar situation, how would you stabilize your core personal values?
Dude, if you can get motivation for a month from one YouTube video, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I would just watch one every first of the month. I think most people watch those videos and are hyped for 15 minutes.
Yeah. I wouldn't I don't know anybody who uses motivational videos and is successful. Honestly, I don't know a single person. What I do know are people who've gone through Tony Robbins and they've done the exercise of what do I want? And then they get very clear on why do I want it and what will happen if I don't do it.
Just to be clear, are you talking about the Dickens exercise or personal power?
But they're the same thing kind of.
Okay.
But
Well, just if you look up Tony Robbins, you're going to get 1,000.
Personal Power 2, amazing program by Tony Robbins. I know the days. It's like day 2 and day 6, real brief. If you sit down and you list out, let's say, I want to work on my charisma. Why? And then you clearly write out the world, because there's this particular person and I want them to like me and I can see myself getting this job and my group of friends isn't inspiring and I can hang out with that group of friends. You make that clear. And then you also make clear, well, what will happen if I don't do it? I'll stagnate. I'll stay in this group. They'll drag me down. I'll probably, not get to date this person I like. I'll have to settle for a job I don't want. When you get clear on the why, that motivation becomes intrinsic. So check out Personal Power. It's to call it motivation is such an understatement because it's lasting versus these motivational videos, which are like change your state, feel good.
Yeah.
So check that course out.
Yeah. Personally, all the biggest motivation that stuck was from a strong North Star. Was from reading a book about charisma and going, oh my God, wait, what? I can do this. And it just gave me a goal of what my life would be like. I read the 4-Hour Work Week and it was waking up on the beach in Brazil, drinking a coconut. And that image stuck with me and I could work towards it. But it was never a video of somebody screaming at me or saying something profound about how motivation works. I needed a dream to chase, a strong why.
Makes sense. How much time?
We have time for like one more.
Cool.
So the last one, you have touched on your trouble finding connection in points in your life where you go on date after date and the women you meet are perfectly great women, but you don't feel like you can really connect with them. I've been struggling with this for years, rarely feeling any sort of connection or chemistry with the people I meet through online dating. I believe you eventually concluded this was due to a mental block you had within yourself. My question is whether you have been able to resolve this at all and if you have any advice for someone working through something similar.
So I don't know is this to me, I imagine?
That is not my problem. I connect strongly on the first date, and then the problem is quickly I realized the connection was more about excitement than.
Well, I think that's a different version of this problem.
Sure, but it ends on like the third date. And it's rare to have a fifth date, but
got it. No, I don't have a particular conclusion in mind. What I will say is that if you're finding that you're not, you're finding that you're not connecting, it's because there's a part of your filter that isn't geared towards actually connecting. Meaning you're on this dating app and you're swiping right for the people you find most physically attractive who have X physical feature and skipping pretty quickly over the bio. Like weirdly enough, those few sentences tell you a lot about someone. You can find out if they choose to be funny, if they say swipe left if. You're like, okay, here's a person who finds things they don't like and is critical. Like
if you can't handle me at my worst.
Yeah,
you can't have me at my
like
best.
people, and also what's going on? Is this person out hiking or are they out at the club or are they all selfies from this angle? I mean, you can.
That's a great point, actually. If you're looking not at the shape of the person, but what they're doing,
it's just what is this person broadcasting? I mean, you can actually determine and filter for things that might be a better fit. So ask yourself, what have I filtered for in the past? Chances are it's physical attraction, and what would actually make me happy? Is an outdoor, yoga loving, whatever, into this kind of music. There's likes to play video games, whatever. It's that your filters are off. It's that your filter to get the person out is one thing.
So now you're sitting down with someone that hasn't been vetted for you. There's no reason for you to like,
and you
they
quite
weren't vetted for that.
Yes. And
That's
so you might want to try filtering, and this might mean to swipe right on somebody that you might not initially consider very attractive, just to go in the direction of like, okay, this person has the personality demographic that I think I would really like. And you might surprise yourself. Now, I'm not saying pick someone that you think under no circumstances could I feel attraction to them, but you might be surprised when you get in person. We've talked about this, is that on dating apps, people are so much more critical because it's so easy.
Oh, I used to talk about my friends in bars because this where there'd be a girl over there and they'd be like looking in that direction.
She's not pretty
hey,
enough.
why don't you go talk to her? Oh, she's not pretty enough. And I said, imagine that she's laughing at a joke you said with her hand on your chest. And it's like, oh, she's way beyond she's pretty enough. Like that would be so exhilarating.
Yeah.
But in order to protect themselves, they just have an incredibly high standard.
Yeah, which is not really their standard at all. So I think that's that. Winding down. Cool. Thank you, everybody. To our patrons, you guys rock. I'm started or tried to start a book club. I'm horrible at staying in line with books, so I'm figuring it out. But I am kind of doing updates on the books that I'm reading in the Patreon.
Oh, nice.
If we can make a book club work, I don't want to promise it. It'll be available to all patrons. But you guys rock. Also, by the way, as we hop into this interview, unfortunately, there were some technical difficulties on Chris's side, his carbon monoxide thing. We don't really know. Something was beeping when he was speaking. We apologize in advance of that. We've tried to remove it as much as we can, but it is a very interesting conversation. So hopefully you can get through that because we have a lot of fun stuff to say. Yeah. So here's that.
And he did very well considering that he is losing oxygen to the brain at a rapid rate. So very good for him. So here we are. We got Chris Johnson, fan of Charisma on Command, fan of the podcast, wrote in and mentioned that you are a journalist working in Washington, D.C. You've done White House correspondence, talked to President Obama, talked to President Trump, and were kind enough to come on so that we could talk about media, because this is an area that Charlie and I have a lot of questions around, the objectivity of media, especially since it seems to have such a big influence on how people perceive the truth and reality these days, depending on what news they consume. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, I've been following Charisma on Command for a long time. You guys have been very helpful for me and just developing some of my communication skills as a journalist here in Washington, D.C. So I'm so stoked that you guys are having me on your podcast. It's awesome.
That's great.
Awesome.
So you want to hop in with the questions?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing that I'm always curious of with media is every time that you see an article, you can kind of guess where it's from, right? If I showed you a bunch of articles and I said, some of these are from CNN, some are from Fox News, all I'm going to give you is the headline, you'd have like a 90% accuracy in terms of predicting who was covering that news. And so my question is, what happens if you or someone in your organization wants to write a story that goes against majority opinion?
Within the organization.
A la someone at Fox News wants to write a pro-Biden piece.
Right. And just to start off with, I write for the Washington Blade. We're a small alternative LGBTQ newspaper here in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to be I'm answering this question from that perspective, just to preface what I'm going to say here.
Sure. And
I think that the issue, in my experience, like from every employer that I've worked for, the issue hasn't been so much the, opinion of the company or your bosses, who generally understand you're there to do a news, report the news as it is. The issue is more of the audience. These like Fox News, MSNBC, they have built up audiences for people who want to hear certain news. Rachel Maddow's show is always going to be something about how Trump screwed something up. And then OANN, Trump's favorite news network, is always going to be how it's going to be very sycophantic and very flattering. So everyone who's reading this is expecting to get that kind of information from those news outlets. So you say you're running for one of those outlets and you, like Rachel Maddow, want to say, well, Trump didn't do half bad on this, or OANN want to be somehow Trump screwed that up. Well, then people who are like following those news outlets, if they read that, they're going to get mad and they will make their views known. They might potentially call for people to stop, following you. This happened quite a bit, I think, in the New York Times. I think it's going through kind of a transition as a lot of more progressive voices are coming forward, and they're kind of calling for changes in the New York Times and how there's always a complaint. Well, I'm canceling my subscription because of this op-ed or this news story, that kind of thing. So, and then that really registers though with the company. I mean, they need to have a sustainable audience in order to keep going. So if you have your audience is not following you, then that's going to be a problem. So you really have to take that into consideration as you're writing stuff. I mean, my audience is generally speaking very progressive, very at least interested in what's going on with the LGBTQ community. So I have to kind of take that into consideration when I'm presenting my news, just so and it's not like I'm like I have to obscure anything, at least in my opinion. It's just the presentation of it, making like if I have to give a piece of information to an audience that might not want to hear this information, thinking about what's the best way to position this and why I think that this information is going to be relevant to that readership. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, it's not so much the editorial, the management side of it. It's just the audience side.
So do you feel like your obligation is to, I mean, there's no such thing as like the truth, but to trying to report as honestly as possible? Do you feel like your obligation is to try to provide the best stuff for your audience, and best means things they'll like the most and share the most? What's your first God, I guess, that you worship when it comes to writing your stories?
Those things are two different goals. I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, the truth, if it's something is truthful, is the truth, something is an important news story, then your readers are going to share it. They're going to have a lot of clicks. It's going to get a lot of attention, just by the very nature of the fact that it's an important news story.
Well, is that, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but is that true? Because I thought you just said basically if you wrote something that was true, but was something your audience doesn't like, that they're not going to share it, they're going to try to cancel you.
Exactly. Well, that's what I was going to move on to. There is kind of a corollary to that, and it's kind of a concession, and that you have to kind of, you have to take that into consideration. You have to take that into consideration as you present the news. I mean, and those are like, and one news story, you might think, okay, this is going to be giving me a lot of clicks. This is going to fulfill that goal of getting a lot of shares, getting a lot of clicks, getting a lot of web traffic, getting a lot of attention. And the other goal, other news story, maybe it doesn't have the kind of same goal as getting so much attention, but you think it's going to be important for other reasons. It might be speaking to like more of a limited audience within your audience. For example, I wrote a piece a while back on how there were, within the Biden campaign, there were people, there's a piece of legislation called the Equality Act, which is an important piece of LGBTQ rights legislation. And there are people who I was speaking to in the circles who are concerned that he doesn't have the staff set up right now in order to, to make this legislation become law if and when it becomes president next year. And so it was critical of the Biden campaign and its staff. And I mean, that didn't get hardly any shares at all, because I think a lot of people didn't want to be complicit in that, this criticism of Biden from the LGBT side. But it was an important story to do nonetheless, because this issue is, this issue is LGBTQ rights is something that our audience is really concerned about. And even though it didn't get a lot of shares, I still think it got a lot of web traffic. It got a decent amount of web traffic, and a different much views, because people are interested in this topic. So I guess then that'd be one instance when shares and web traffic are not necessarily the same thing.
As you were talking, I thought a lot about our business, because it's the same thing. And what you said something that made me realize, which I think is true, that we have a democratic society in the sense that the power actually is in the audience. We've talked about this a little bit earlier today. The tastemakers, try as they might, have a difficult time dictating what the masses ought to think and feel. And so, like you're kind of describing, they're responding to what the masses want. So, your readership wants one particular view. Our charisma viewers want one particular character. They want us to, if I were to go on there and talk about, this isn't something that I think, how Robert Downey Jr. isn't charismatic, actually, people would riot, right? Like,
or how Evan Turner is incredibly charismatic. He's
or that Mark Zuckerberg is really, he's the guy who has it completely under control. Like, if I don't think that. And weirdly enough, I don't know if you're familiar, but Noam Chomsky has this idea of manufactured consent, which is to say that it doesn't require me to censor myself to create content that the audience wants, because by the very virtue of the fact that I created a 4 million subscriber YouTube channel, the filter was already on my beliefs as I rose through the ranks, such that anyone in your organization doesn't need to be told, hey, I would prefer if you had this view of Donald Trump and this view of Joe Biden, I would prefer that you supported him. It's just, if you're going to work at this newspaper and you're going to apply, rise up, do well, get along with your colleagues, that is a kind of a baked in thing that occurs not just with you, but it occurs in our organization, it occurs at Fox News and CNN, et cetera. So it's just interesting. I don't even know that I have anything other than a question as I'm sort of reflecting on this, that really it's the tribalism of the audience that is what creates such difficulty. And I have the same split as you do, where I go, okay, one for me, one for them. I'm going to do a Don Draper video, and then I'm going to do Sadhguru, and nobody's going to watch Sadhguru. And that's why the podcast exists, because it's an outlet for me to talk about some of the things that are less popular, but more near and dear to my heart. So I mean, no question. I'm just, it's an interesting insight that really, it seems to be the audience that wants their side protected and the other side attacked, that creates that polarization, and not necessarily some grand scheme coming down from on high.
Right, but I don't want to limit too much kind of the autonomy of the creator of content in this process. I mean, the audience is, an essential part. Otherwise, you're just talking to yourself.
Yeah.
But I mean, as a creator, you have ways to approach, your the content you're creating so that's more palatable to the audience, and they would want to consume it more readily. I saw a really interesting video by the Poynter Institute, which is a nonprofit for journalists, and they made some recommendations on headlines. And one thing I thought was really interesting is just by some simple changes, you can get a lot more interest, a lot more clicks. Like if you have a story about like a business story and the headline includes revenue, not a lot of people are going to be clicking on that. However, you put in the headline instead of revenue makes money, you're going to get a lot of clicks on that. So, I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, there's a lot of different factors going into this relationship between the person creating media and the consumer of the media. And I don't want to and some of that is audience and some of it is the creator, but it's there's a lot. It's a give and take. It's in a way it's kind of a collaborative process. Even as a creator, you're not very aware of it, because when you create the stuff, you put it online, and you're not very conscious of the audience. But that's there.
Got it. Do you want to go down the list?
No. Well, I have a question. It's completely unrelated though. So, as someone who's in news media, do you have a critique for the big news organizations like Fox or CNN, or do you think that they largely carry themselves well?
I am reluctant to criticize any particular news outlet, just because I just don't really feel, as a general matter, that is a good, like, there's one outlet that I'm going to say is not doing what they're supposed to, mostly because it's just my general belief that if you have a platform, you should be able to say basically whatever you want in this country. And then if you have an audience that responds to that, then more power to you. Obviously, you're doing something right. But that is just, some people might object to that. There's people might say that certain outlets are promulgating messages that shouldn't be heard or should be silenced. And that's kind of a rising trend, I think, in the United States, but it's not something that I subscribe to.
Got it. So your belief is basically that they have the right to write whatever they want, not so much, there's no such thing as like a dangerous truth, and that as long as their audience responds to it, that's their right to write about it. Is that fair?
I would say that. And if there is a dangerous truth, then the what's the opposite of dangerous truth? The safe truth. I don't know, we can use that to counteract the dangerous truth. And because you have to, which is the dangerous truth and which is the not dangerous truth? It's very subjective. Yeah. And so but if something is very dangerous, it should be made evident as to why that's dangerous, and the regular truth, as it were, would be able to address that.
Got it. Yeah, that's cool. As someone who works at a progressive outlet, I thought perhaps you'd have a different view, but I agree with you.
Cool.
Yeah. So
and I have to say, like, I'm just very I'm with a progressive outlet. I'm not aligned with anything, and it's kind of and that's just the approach I take to my journalism. I definitely want to try to incorporate all sides, even though I work for a progressive outlet. I definitely try to get maybe one conservative viewpoint into a larger piece that I'm working on, just so I can get my audience the balanced take. Now, I just went through a thing about how the audience is not going to probably like the conservative take, but I just make sure that it's presented in a way that is something that'd be more accepted then, but so that they're also aware of what the other side is thinking.
I have a question. So how long have you been in journalism?
I've been in journalism for a long time. I'm just going to kind of, embarrassingly reflect my age here. It was right after the September 11th attacks that I got involved in journalism.
Okay, so you've been there for a long time. Congratulations on your skincare routine. You're killing it. But so Donald Trump famously popularized the idea of fake news just a few years ago. Do you think, and now even beyond Donald Trump, I think both sides of the aisle definitely have their eye on this idea of fake news, which is often spread via social media. Do you think that Donald Trump called something as it was arising, or has it been around since 2001 in a way that people weren't aware? Have the tech giants...
It's been around since people have been able to talk.
Okay.
I mean, people have always been able to gossip.
Yeah.
And people have always been able to spread, what any kind of information they've ever wanted to. We didn't need to have the internet has definitely made communication a lot easier. I mean, and the world is a very tiny place now, but I mean, first of all, I just definitely want to challenge the idea of what exactly is misinformation can be very subjective.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
I mean, obviously, there's certain things that are just right or wrong, but then when we get into, especially when they get the political sphere, I think a lot of these, a lot of things that are decried as misinformation are actually opinions that people disagree with. Mm-hmm. But to your larger point, like how long this has been going on, I mean, you can just kind of go back to, an example I'm thinking about is the election of, I think it was 1960 when John Kennedy was running against Hubert Humphrey. And what happened was in Wisconsin, there was this, I guess there was like a campaign saying that no one's going to vote for John Kennedy because he's Catholic or something like that. Or mm-hmm. you don't vote for Kennedy because he's Catholic. And then that means that the Pope is actually going to run the United States or something like that. And that, as it turns out, was actually put together by a Kennedy supporter out there to actually have the opposite effect, to get more sympathy for Kennedy. So people would come to the polls to vote for him.
Interesting.
So, I mean, this idea of fake news, this idea of misinformation, this has been around for quite a while. Al Gore never said I invented the internet. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not new.
Got it. And I remember the Swift boat attacks and all of these other things. I mean, as I going back through it. So do you think that if the quality of the problem hasn't changed, this has existed, has the quantity changed in a meaningful enough way that it's a serious problem? Or is it really just, no, this is what happens in the world, is that lies sometimes spread faster than the truth. And that's always been something that we've dealt with and doesn't need a special reaction today.
I think that's really difficult to quantify to some extent, especially because I just kind of said that, since people have been able to talk, they've been able to spread misinformation. So it's kind of hard for me to say, well, because now they have computers and they can just kind of go online and access the entire world anytime they want to. It's more, and I guess under that logic, now that I'm thinking about it, that might lend the fact that if something is incorrect that they want to spread around, that might make things a little bit easier. But I mean, word of mouth gets around pretty quickly.
So it sounds like you would be against the idea of some of these tech platforms instituting greater procedures to remove, even identified potential Russian bots or alleged Russian bots or fake news about coronavirus statistics, that you would say this has been around, and correct me if I'm wrong, this has been around forever, and we've always trusted the audience to have to sort through it, and we can't have, some benevolent Mark Zuckerberg deciding what is real and what is fake.
Exactly. I mean, I feel like I said that the audience has a really big role in how an outlet reports its news. I think the audience also has, by virtue of that, then they have a really strong responsibility at the same time in order to manage their news intake and what they're taking. So, I mean, that I think is the first barrier for deciding what is misinformation, what is misinformation online. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when you give those keys to like Mark Zuckerberg or some third party, that to limit what is correct, what is not correct, especially when so many of these things, as I said before, are not necessarily correct or not correct, or just kind of disagreements in a subjective sense. I think that is dangerous because it might be just a truth that people don't want to see is not getting expressed.
Got it. It's interesting because what I'm sort of hearing from you is a view of almost metaphysics, which is to say that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to understand your underlying philosophy, which is that nobody has exclusive access to reality, except perhaps in very rare cases where we're talking numbers. But even then, you sound iffy on that, which is reflective of how I feel. And given that there is no one perfect view of reality, we just have to open this door for like several different views, some of which might be crazy, and then allow for discussion amongst all of us participants in that reality to be like, what do we do with this information? Is that accurate to what you think?
I would say that's a good view of my approach to how media should be run and how, that I think the policing of an individual and an audience's policing of information is how free society should operate. By very nature, you're not free if you're having Facebook or Twitter or these other organizations control what content you can see or what's fake and what's true and what's not true.
Got it.
So I'm a really big proponent of the fact of audience being the first and final arbiter on what is correct and what.
Okay, so we talked about the gay side, and you I guess have implied that the LGBTQIA plus all are at different stages of acceptance, and so even beyond that, I think I'm assuming that you're implying that trans people are lagging behind gay people in acceptance. Is that accurate?
Definitely, I would definitely agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you just have to look at the our current electoral politics. Trans people there's still a degree of fear about them. If you saw the news just this week, there are these ads that this group, the American Principles Project, ran, raising concerns about the Equality Act, the LGBT non-discrimination measure I mentioned way back at the start of the podcast, saying that it would enable boys to compete in girls' sports because the law would ban transgender discrimination. So a transgender girl could compete in the same team as a non-transgender girl. Mm-hmm. And so unlike, we're not really seeing that anymore, I don't think, with gay people. We might have seen that like in the 90s even with George W. Bush campaigning on the federal marriage amendment. He wanted to make a ban on same-sex marriage part of the Constitution. That was in the oddies, but and then in the 90s, we did have Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and
so just to clarify though, I think I am seeing stories, and I don't know the veracity of these stories, where there are transgender boys to girls competing in high school track or in MMA. What's her name? Fallon something
Box.
Other. Are you telling me that those aren't real, or that's not a real concern, or?
I'm not saying they're not real, and that's not a real concern. I think that this is actually something that is being talked about right now, as this issue of trans rights, it's something that needs to be thought about. I mean, in a sense, like these broad measures are meant to protect transgender people in employment and in housing, these basic things, basic areas of life that everyone needs, and making sure that everyone has them. But then these like thorny little issues come up, like transgender participation in sports. And I mean, a lot of different organizations have dealt with this in different ways. I know that some organizations say that you have to have a certain amount of, your testosterone can't be so high, and or if you want to compete in a women's sport. However, then this raises the problem that there are women out there who are not transgender who just naturally have high testosterone.
Why do I have to compete?
All of a sudden that they're being they're having
Totally.
issues
I at one point
and competing with the gender they want to that they want to compete as.
Yeah.
I was 6'2",
this is an issue.
220,
I think
and I
this
had
is some more discussion because obviously people want to be fair, but they also don't want to be exclusionary.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to be something that's going to be talked about quite a while, and it will come to resolution. But at the same time, I think people are like stoking fears about this, boys and girls sports, kind of irrationally in order to inflame fears for political purposes.
Yeah, so I have a lot of trans questions. It's not a topic that I'm versed in, but I do see on both sides philosophical issues in continuity of the idea. So the one idea being, okay, let's measure testosterone. As you said, like there's going to be people like me that are like probably on the lower side of testosterone. It's like, well, wait a second. If I scrape in, do I get to compete all of a sudden in the WNBA?
Well, you can also manipulate it if you just fast or
if I fast or if I
it's for 2 weeks, you can tank your testosterone, take the test, and then be like, all right, cool.
Well, the other weird thing is that sports, like the fact that we have gendered sports is a little bit strange when you consider that what separates me and LeBron James in large portion is the testosterone that we received in our adolescent years. Just like what separates my sister and I is the testosterone that we received in our adolescent years. Now, there's a ton of other things that go into it, but if you're saying that, I can't compete in the same field as my sister because she's at a physical disadvantage, well, why would I have to compete against LeBron James? Because we're clearly not the same kind of human being. And so I don't see a ton of consistency there. It's like if gender is, in fact, a spectrum, then you're going to see not just trans, but you're going to see all different kinds of people lining up in all different kinds of places, and a bifurcation that goes, well, one group over here, one group over here, no longer is tenable. So I think that it raises a lot of philosophical issues that haven't been totally worked through. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying. And I think that having to be these issues that haven't been worked through, I think is kind of where it is right now, because there definitely needs to be discussion on this. I remember I was attending a congressional hearing, I think it was last year, in which someone who was a proponent of Title IX, which is a 1972 law that made equal access for boys and girls in school, including in school sports, saying that we should have she believes in equality. She thinks transgender people should be able to participate in sports, but there should be some kind of gender-based attributes by which we can say, okay, this is somebody that we can allow them to play consistent with their gender identity or not. And if the person doesn't meet those standards, then we can say, I'm sorry, you're not eligible. And much like we have rules for doping and for other things. Mm-hmm. So, I think that this is just an issue that needs to be examined. And I don't really have first of all, I'm not a person who is as a reporter, as a neutral observer. I don't really have I'm not supposed to give you my opinion anyway.
Well, you're not a journalist right now. You can have an opinion
to give you. So, because there's a lot of thorny issues here. I think there is a way to approach this where it's going to be reasonably fair for everyone. Because of course, this issue I don't think is it's coming up a lot in different contexts. Or at least it seems. But I think it's probably more of just because the issue is just so new and it's kind of hard for us to wrap our head around. I think it's more prominent than it actually is. I think it's actually a very rare situation in which this emerges.
Yeah. So I'll just put the call outs because we've talked for a minute here, and even it can be you. But if there is anyone out there, trans or otherwise, that feels like they have a lot of understanding of the trans issues and the things that are coming up, I have a ton of questions, because not even from the political side, I'm interested in the philosophy of it, because one of the core tenets is that that gender identity is, I believe, to a degree fluid, which is not held by all trans people, but there's a fact that it can, it's not binary and it's not locked in, are basically huge parts of it, and it's not necessarily determined by the genitals that you have at birth. So if that is the case, there's a lot of, which I'm open to, there's a lot of implications that has for instance, there was a guy in my high school that was 5'2" that was, if you were to, I guess, chart him, yes, he had male genitals, but probably had very low testosterone, had, never grew after a certain thing, weighed 100 pounds. Where does he fall? Who does he compete with in these types of sporting events? When we're trying to get diversity in the workplace, is it diversity by genitalia, in which case he has a penis and his male genitalia, or is it diversity by testosterone, in which case he might qualify as this quote unquote, and I'm not trying to be mean to him at all, this female group? If it is the case that it is not so obvious and easy to separate people, what does that then mean for diversity? At least according to gender, which seems to be obvious at first blush, but it may in fact not be. So, well,
there's one other element I think you didn't mention there. That is gender identity. What is the gender to which this person subscribes to? Mm-hmm. And as a person who's a free thinking person who's able to evaluate their own gender, I think that that is an important factor for consideration too. Totally. And I think that it may even be the ultimate factor in just about every case. Might be some situations where that isn't off the top of my head, like sports might be one issue. But if a person is going to say, okay, this is my gender male, this is my gender female, then that is probably going to be a key determinant as to which, facilities, which activities they're going to be.
Sure. I think a difficult thing with that is bad actors. So, yeah. You had the guy Zuby who did set the women's deadlift record, right? He walked in, said, I'm a female right now, and then set the deadlift record for women. And so who determines bad actors? And I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about, there's definitely going to be someone who says, look, you're just acting up to get attention from your parents. You're not actually trans. And so if you can't take one person at their word, you can't take anybody at their word. And so who now is determining people who are authentically feeling this if it's not the individual themselves? And I think that all of these become very, very sticky issues, because if it suits someone's career purposes to identify as a woman so as to get a promotion, there's someone in America, and more than one person, that would do that in order to, without actually feeling what those subjective internal feelings of feeling like a woman, because they knew that it would advance their career. And so I think these are very important issues. If what you are is determined by how you feel and what you say, how do we sort through a world where we're categorizing people? Okay, you can have this job or not have this job, or participate in this sport or not participate in this sport. So if anyone is out there that is thinking, oh, I have the answers to this, or I can add some nuance, let us know, because this is a conversation that I think is not been had, because it really, there's a whole opening of fascinating philosophical fallout that I think is a fun conversation.
Right. And I think that for the instance of fraud, a bad actor saying that they're transgender when in fact they're not, just because, for example, the example that you gave, a man participating in a women's weightlifting competition. I mean, there are ways to prove fraud. If something is challenged, like, okay, I'm transgender, therefore I get to participate in this sport. Well, I can say, well, no, you're not. Mm-hmm. And there are ways to, if it's a case of a sport, for example, that might be one instance when a person would have to be required to show like a doctor's diagnosis of being transgender.
What about a job?
And having gone through treatment, that kind of thing.
Well, let's say I'm applying to a high six-figure engineering job. Historically, more male applicants than female applicants.
They need
let's say there's a quota that says, well, women are 50% of the population. You need to be at least 35% female, but the applicant pool is 90% men, 10% women. There's an incentive there as well to identify as whichever gender. Let's say it's 90% women. Now there's an advantage to identify as male. And so do you take someone at their word? Do you require a doctor's note? If so, you're going to be requiring it of people who are genuinely, they feel like they're trans. But if you don't, you will get people who are going, well, I'll be in the 10% applicant pool that's going to get 35% of the jobs.
And to be clear, doctors have been, people have had what do they call cataracts for about 30 years to get weed. You know what I mean? There's going to be doctors out there. Anxiety. There's going to be doctors that are signing out.
Prescriptions skyrocketed.
So in any event, I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but the really fascinating philosophical thing is, where does the truth of certain characteristics about me lie? Is it in my subjective experience of myself? Is it a conversation that I have to have with you? Where is the truth of who I am? And so is gender different than other things about me, like my race? You know what I mean? Like what determines my race? If I go to my ancestry.com and it turns out me looking the way I do am, say, 15% African origin, but I identify and feel strongly tied to that community, who negotiates that? Who feels that? And I think it really, transgender is the issue that's sort of deeper at its core, is where does the truth of who you are lie? Is it a negotiation that we have together? Do you tell me or do I tell you? And how does that all work? Which I think is...
And especially, how does it play in a world that moves more towards legislated affirmative action, let's say? Mm-hmm. Where, because to your point,
there is now incentive.
Listen, there's no quotas and there's no sports, let's say. Whatever. Identify as whatever gender and whatever races you want, because we're gonna look at your resume. We're gonna block your name. We're just gonna look at where you went to school and your job experience. But if the world is moving more towards something where it says we're looking for equity, not equality of opportunity, but equal outcomes, then how you allow people to identify suddenly plays a major role. You know what I mean? And so, what gender are you? What race are you? How do you identify? Mm-hmm. Now it has real world consequences, as in an attempt to be progressive, quotas come out. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's something that's unimportant just because today it's not necessarily important what race or gender you identify as for careers.
It's just fascinating. Where is reality? Is reality inside of me? Is it in between you and I, or is it in the collective? No, you are X. They tell me.
Is it a doctor because they have a degree?
I don't know. Yeah, it's fascinating. Do you have any thoughts on any of that in terms of like...
No pressure, by the way. No, it's absolutely not what you came on to talk about. And I would like to have somebody who is trans or deep in the community come on as well.
Right. I mean, there's a lot going on there. And I do think that somebody who actually is trans and has that experience would be able to definitely address that more than I can. I just think that for some of these other categories, for example, you talked about, well, if I can be transgender, why can't I be transracial? Mm-hmm. If, for example, I just decided, you know what, I'm obviously a white guy. So, you know what, I'm actually going to be Latino. I'm actually going to be Asian. I mean, there are some cultural sensitivity issues, I think, to that. Like, for example, you're just going to sort of like take on this group that has experienced as a hardship. And, I still get a real connection with the Black community.
Hold on, we lost audio for a second. So I heard I have a real connection with the Black community. Go ahead.
Like I say, I'm a member of the Black community. And so because I really identify with that So, so I'm black now. And I think that by doing that, that puts yourself, like you're taking on a certain, almost like you're getting into a community that has been collectively been suffering and collectively been enduring and protecting itself in a way that I don't think gender is quite so much. I mean, there obviously has been a long history of misogyny in the worldwide, but I just think that when you start saying like the concept of being transracial compared to being transgender, I think that that really has a lot of implications about going into a group that you're taking on a certain attributes that you're taking on a group that has histories of oppression and people in that group might be offended by the fact that you're trying to claim that identity.
What if a black person feels white though? Can it go that way? And what if it's to their advantage?
It's a different question. Like a trans, I mean.
So here's the thing. I think we're missing.
In this hypothetical situation.
It will happen. It will happen because here's what I'm saying is that what is the limiting principle? If where does how I define myself? Where is the boundary of that? Where does it bump up against something? And I don't know what the limiting principle is. I'm not saying that transgender shouldn't exist or shouldn't be accepted because of it, but I do think that philosophically, what we have to go is where does my description of myself stop and bump into your experience of me and everyone else's experience of me? And it's I don't know that there's a clear answer, but it needs an answer.
Especially because I think there are women that would disagree with you and would say that females and I'm not saying I believe this, but you would get someone who would say females historically very oppressed, have been the victims of patriarchy in such a way that when you are a white man who identifies as a woman, you are coming into my house at whatever age. Let's say I do it at 33. Well, you didn't have to deal with all of the sexism, the catcalling, the oppression.
It's the J.K. Rowling issue.
Being told I wasn't good at math in high school. Now you're 33 and you just want to come into my thing. I'm not saying that's a good argument or bad argument, but I do think it's unfair to say that it doesn't parallel the African American experience. I think there are women who would say it's quite similar. Certainly, I think the women who run BLM would say that there's oppression for being black, and there's oppression for being women, and there's oppression for being queer. That's at least my understanding from reading their statements. So I think that to allow people to identify whatever their gender is, I do think that the next domino may be race. And I think saying that it's not is kind of like saying that it's 1980 and obviously your genitals determine your gender. You know what I mean?
I'm just interested in the philosophy of it, quite frankly. I want to understand, because here's the truth. I'm interested in, like, what am I? I don't know. Am I what other people tell me I am? Am I what I think I am? Am I a negotiation between you and I?
Yeah, I'd love to have someone on who has a hard belief about this, who's like, no, I figured out where I think we all should draw the line.
Yeah.
And then we can explore whether that's philosophically sound or not.
Sure. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you guys kept saying, why drawing the line? There needs to be an answer to this. And I honestly, I don't really see why we need to have an answer to it. We're progressing as a society, adjusting to these new concepts of identity, including being transgender. And then we are making accommodations as we see fit as a society for these people. I don't see why we do have to have a definitive answer. I just don't, that's not really clear to me. I mean, these are things for us to think about and talk about on podcasts, where do we draw the line? Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it that way? But I just don't really see the need to have something so defined as to like what is the rule for this. I think that any situation is going to be different. There are some things that are going to be subjective. Where there's really no right or wrong answer. So why it needs to be very detailed is not defined isn't very clear.
Sure,
I have an answer. Do you want to go?
Yeah, and I'm not a politician, and I do think that society progresses in bits. You know what I mean? It does. They don't. There's like society doesn't introduce a principle and then live it out for 100 years. What we do is we take these steps and then kind of find our footing as we go. So for those people creating policy, I totally understand. But I do think that there are when things change, there are predictable outcomes. So if gay men advocate for the ability to marry one another, it's predictable that gay women will advocate. That stands to reason. So if we go to war, which we have in the past, and the selective service is only for men, and men in the past have tried to dodge the draft by it being exempt for all sorts of reasons, and we're at war with China, I think you're going to see a lot of transgender men to women. And I think that being able to define yourself out of a group that you don't want to be in and into a group that you do want to be in is going to become far more commonplace than you would. And I think it will have things that I can't even anticipate today. But when you incentivize people with you can claim something about yourself, as you can essentially, and I'm not saying this is what trans people are doing, but you person can tell a lie in order to enter into a group that you find better.
Yeah, escape the draft.
To escape the draft or to get the job or to whatever, you're going to see that happen. Now, granted, maybe we don't have to have all the answers to these questions. We can deal with them as they come up, but to not anticipate them, it seems foolhardy. These things will happen. They've already started happening, and so they're worth thinking about in advance of war with China, for instance, when we have no more able-bodied young men to do the fighting.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from on that. But I think that, and we probably should be. The reason why we have laws is so that we anticipate a situation that will happen and try to deter that from happening, or when that does happen, we have a system in place where we can address it. That's why we have a system of rules to begin with.
Yeah.
I am kind of skeptical about this particular hypothetical about being transgender to get out of the draft. But I think you could kind of be, that could be challenged as fraud. And that's something that you could probably have to get like certification from a doctor from.
Sure.
For that purpose.
I mean, it was the same thing with flat feet, and it was the same thing with joining the National Guard. I mean, I guess the point is people will, when you set up a system and there is, I don't want to go to war, and there are these things that can get you out of it, or, I would like that job. Just people play systems is what I'm saying. And so what we're talking about is creating a new system which says you are not necessarily the gender into which you were assigned or born into, depending on your perspective at birth. I'm just saying expect people to play that system. Now, you could still move forward with it. That doesn't mean that you need to put a stop to transgender acceptance or all sorts of things. I'm not at all saying that. I am just saying people play systems. They play the tax systems, they find loopholes, they find ways to exploit things. So consider that as you make changes to the system. And this is a large change to the system, because we really do bifurcate a lot of our society, whether we like it or not, into things that men do and things that women do. Is that appropriate? Maybe that'll all break down in the future, and maybe everyone will be eligible for the selective service.
The thing. Maybe the answer is you let people identify as whatever they want, but you draft men and women.
Yeah.
And the question is, do we as a society like that? Do we like the impact that
you
has
remove
on the
Title
population?
IX, and then there's and then it doesn't matter what you identify as. You are competing in this pool of people.
Me and my sister and LeBron are all going out for the one basketball team in our high school instead of having a men's and women's. Not saying that's the solution.
Or you do, and then you add weight class, and you go, okay, anyone under 120 pounds. That's how
there will be solutions. I guess I'm just curious what people who have strong feelings about this and who know their answers to this, what they would say to these things.
Yeah. And just to be clear, because I don't want this to come across to you or anyone else, I'm saying these are reasons to stop the transgender rights movement at all.
No, these are things to figure out.
These are just fascinating questions that it brings up that I, as a philosophy person, dig. Like these are the things that I like to riff on. So to your question, why do we need to know? We don't need to. It's just what I like to talk about.
Well, and I think the thing is, if you want to progress these, then to some extent you should have an answer to this, because it's going to get asked at some point, right? Like if this is your thing, if you're really want to move the trans movement forward, it's worth thinking about this stuff, because these are the exact questions people are going to ask if it comes to be that trans are completely accepted and self-identification is completely accepted. Then you kind of need answers to these questions. So I don't view them as anti-trans questions. They're things that we have to talk about if the movement is to move forward.
Right. I think that they would agree with you on that. I mean, that's kind of like a lot of the transgender movement right now is about getting laws that guarantee them access to things like employment, housing and healthcare, whether or not they're going to be able to obtain transition-related care like gender reassignment surgery from a certain hospital, whether that's going to be publicly subsidized or not. These are a lot of things that are the transgender movement is definitely seeking. So, I mean, they do want to have general guidelines for how we address these issues.
Yeah. And by the way, I'll say, if you they don't have to be a fan of the podcast, but if somebody that you work with or that you know or in the community is interested in these kinds of conversations and wants to hop on, definitely shoot us a comment or let us know, because it's not something that I've had the chance to talk to a trans person about yet. And they might have answers to all of this stuff that I just haven't encountered.
Cool.
Dope. Anything else from you?
No, I think this was a good conversation.
Chris, is there anything? I know that we will add your Twitter in the bottom corner. Is there anything that you wanted to close with or add?
Let's see. We kind of hit on a lot of topics here, and a lot. And I just kind of wish I could find a way to kind of bring the two things together, like the role of the media and the role of finding a determination and self-identification, and whether that's appropriate for where we draw the lines in terms of, for example, being transgender. And I just kind of want to try to extemporaneously find a way to fuse those two together. And I guess the best way I can do that is to talk about the role of LGBTQ media.
Okay.
Because of which I am a part of. And I think it's in a way this kind of shows why that there's still a role for LGBT community, even as mainstream outlets write about and cover issues affecting the LGBTQ community. That by having a media source that is, specifically tailored for the LGBTQ community, and in most cases, produced by the LGBTQ community, we have kind of a more distinct line to more of a clearer window to what the community is thinking on this issue, and that window is something that, not just LGBTQ people, but all people in all society can look at for guidance.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I think the other thing that as again, extemporaneously trying to bring these two together, what I'm feeling like, and it's exciting and scary, is that we are really entering into what is inevitable, is this age of relativity. Whereas if you go back hundreds of years, like, look, there's one God, this is the way the world is, and this is it. And if you can't get with the program, you're missing it. And what we are increasingly moving towards is, I think, an understanding of the honest fact that truth is often relative. Like, what is the truth of this? Well, it depends on your perspective, right? And is this statement true? Well, it depends on which way you're looking, okay? What is someone's gender identity? Well, it's fixed. Well, maybe it's not so fixed, right? Maybe it's relative to the culture in which you live, because if you move to a different culture, they've got completely different rules over in Thailand about, two genders and all that sort of thing. So biologists out there, I even know that there's an argumentation that, or a line of argument that XY chromosomes are terribly, completely distinct. I have a suspicion that what you would find is, and I'm not certain, I'm not a biologist, that if you dug into the microscopic view of the chromosomes, that not every Y chromosome is exactly the same, and that some of them are like tending in a different direction, that there's not just these binaries in any area of life. And as a society, we are coping with the growth pains of, like, how do we deal with all of this relativity in a world where we need to work together and kind of agree on something that is fixed outside of our perception. It's really a crazy challenge. I don't know how to do it, but I do. We're sorting it out, I guess.
Well, you can tell by our responses which one of us is the person who works in media and which one is interested in philosophy and metaphysics by those responses.
Exactly. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on, man. This has been super fun.
Thank you so much. I had a blast.